Around the year 995, in the royal halls of Roskilde, or perhaps at the fortress of Jelling, a son was born to Sweyn Forkbeard, who would eventually reshape the political landscape of northern Europe. Cnut Sveinsson entered the world as a member of the Jelling dynasty, one of the most formidable royal lineages in Viking Age Scandinavia. His grandfather, Harald Bluetooth, had already established Denmark as a unified Christian kingdom and erected the famous Jelling stones that proclaimed his conversion and conquest of both Denmark and Norway. This was no ordinary princeling born into obscurity, but rather a child destined to inherit the accumulated power, ambition, and strategic vision of 3 generations of Danish kings. The Jelling dynasty represented the culmination of centuries of Danish political evolution. Harald Bluetooth, Cnut's grandfather, had transformed Denmark from a collection of competing petty kingdoms into a centralised state capable of projecting power across the North Sea. The massive earthworks at Jelling, the construction of ring fortresses like Trelleborg and Fyrkat, and the establishment of a professional military system all testified to the organisational capabilities that young Cnut would inherit. More significantly, Harald's conversion to Christianity around 960 had positioned Denmark as a bridge between the pagan Viking world and Christian Europe, a strategic advantage that would prove crucial in Cnut's later imperial ambitions. Sweyn Forkbeard, Cnut's father, had built upon this foundation with characteristic Viking ruthlessness and political acumen. After deposing Harald Bluetooth around 987, Sweyn had consolidated Danish power and begun the systematic exploitation of Anglo-Saxon England through increasingly sophisticated military campaigns. Unlike the opportunistic raids of earlier Viking generations, Sweyn's operations demonstrated careful planning, logistical coordination, and clear political objectives. The massive tribute payments extracted from England, the Danegeld, had enriched the Danish kingdom beyond previous imagination and provided the resources necessary for maintaining professional armies and fleets. Young Cnut grew up witnessing these transformations firsthand. The Danish court of the late 10th century buzzed with activity as tribute silver flowed in from England. Norwegian jarls sought alliance or submission, and Slavic princes from the Baltic shores sent embassies bearing gifts and seeking favourable trading arrangements. The royal household itself reflected this cosmopolitan character, with Anglo-Saxon hostages, Norwegian exiles, Wendish warriors, and Frankish merchants all contributing to the complex cultural environment that shaped Cnut's early worldview. The prince's education began early and encompassed the full spectrum of skills expected from a Viking Age ruler. Physical training occupied much of his youth, as mastery of weapons and personal combat remained essential qualifications for kingship in Scandinavian society. Cnut learned to wield the long Danish axes that had become synonymous with Viking warfare, practiced sword combat with experienced huscarls, and developed the physical stamina necessary for long campaigns. Archaeological evidence from contemporary warrior graves suggests that elite Danish fighters of this period were exceptionally well equipped, with pattern-welded swords, iron boss shields, and mail shirts representing significant investments in military technology. Beyond individual combat skills, Cnut received instruction in the tactical and strategic principles that governed Viking Age warfare. The Danish military system of the late 10th century had evolved far beyond the informal warbands of earlier generations. Sweyn Forkbeard commanded professional forces organised around the institution of the Herd, the royal household troops, supplemented by regional levies and allied contingents. Young Cnut observed the careful coordination required to assemble, supply and deploy these forces across the challenging geography of the North and Baltic Seas. The logistics of moving hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors demanded sophisticated planning capabilities that would serve him well in his later conquests. Naval warfare received particular emphasis in Cnut's military education. The Danish fleet represented the kingdom's primary strategic asset. enabling rapid deployment of forces across vast distances and providing the mobility necessary for successful campaigns in England and Norway. The longships of this period, exemplified by vessels like the Skuldelev ships discovered in Roskilde Fjord, combined remarkable seaworthiness with shallow draft capabilities that allowed operations in rivers and coastal waters. Cnut learned to read weather patterns, navigate by sun and stars, and coordinate complex fleet movements involving dozens of vessels. The political dimension of Cnut's education proved equally important. Scandinavian kingship in this period required constant negotiation with powerful jarls, wealthy merchants and regional assemblies. The king ruled through consensus and personal charisma rather than bureaucratic authority, making diplomatic skills essential for effective governance. Cnut observed his father's interactions with the great men of Denmark, learning to balance competing interests while maintaining royal prerogatives. The regular assemblies held at Jelling and other royal centres provided practical lessons in the arts of persuasion and political compromise. Christianity's growing influence in Denmark profoundly shaped Cnut's intellectual and spiritual development. Unlike his pagan ancestors, who had viewed the world through the lens of Germanic mythology and warrior culture, Cnut came of age in a kingdom officially committed to the Christian faith. The conversion initiated by Harold Bluetooth had introduced new concepts of kingship, divine sanction, and moral authority that would fundamentally alter Scandinavian political culture. Churches built at Jelling, Roskilde, and other royal centres served not merely as places of worship, but as symbols of Denmark's integration into the broader European Christian community. The young prince encountered Christianity through both formal instruction and daily observation. Danish bishops, many trained in continental schools, introduced him to Latin literacy and Christian theology. The concept of divine kingship, borrowed from Carolingian and Ottonian models, suggested that royal authority derived from God rather than merely from personal prowess and popular acclaim. This theological framework would later prove crucial in legitimising Cnut's rule over diverse populations in England and Norway, providing ideological justification for imperial ambitions that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. However, the Christianization of Denmark remained incomplete during Cnut's youth. Pagan traditions persisted alongside Christian innovations, creating a syncretic religious culture that combined elements from both belief systems. Archaeological evidence from late 10th century Denmark reveals Christian symbols alongside Thor's hammers, suggesting that religious conversion proceeded gradually rather than through sudden transformation. This religious complexity provided Cnut with valuable experience in managing diverse populations with different spiritual traditions, skills that would prove essential when ruling over Anglo-Saxon Christians, Norwegian pagans, and Danish converts. The wealth flowing into Denmark from English tribute payments exposed young Cnut to the sophisticated monetary economy of late Anglo-Saxon England. Unlike Scandinavia, where barter and gift exchange dominated economic relationships, England possessed a developed system of royal mints, standardised coinage, and commercial markets. The thousands of Anglo-Saxon silver pennies that arrived annually as Danegeld represented not merely treasure, but evidence of administrative capabilities that far exceeded anything available in contemporary Scandinavia. Cnut learned to appreciate the connection between effective governance and economic prosperity, lessons that would inform his later policies as King of England. English hostages and exiles at the Danish court provided additional insights into Anglo-Saxon society and politics. These individuals, captured during Sweyn's campaigns or fleeing factional disputes in England, brought detailed knowledge of English administrative practices, legal traditions, and political divisions. Through conversations with these displaced Englishmen, Cnut gained understanding of the sophisticated governmental machinery that generated the wealth his father extracted through military pressure. The Anglo-Saxon system of shires, hundreds, and royal officials represented administrative innovations that could potentially be adapted for use in Denmark and other conquered territories. The The prince also observed the careful intelligence networks that supported Danish military operations in England. Swene Forkbeard maintained contacts with disaffected Anglo-Saxon nobles, monitored political developments at the English court, and cultivated relationships with Scandinavian settlers in the Danelaw. This information-gathering apparatus required diplomatic finesse and cultural sensitivity, as Danish agents needed to navigate the complex social hierarchies and political allegiances of Anglo-Saxon England. Cnut learned to value intelligence and preparation over purely military solutions, developing the analytical skills necessary for successful long-term planning. By 1013, as Swene Forkbeard prepared for his final assault on Anglo-Saxon England, 18-year-old Cnut had received an education that uniquely prepared him for the challenges of medieval kingship. He possessed the military skills expected of a Viking warrior, the political acumen required for Scandinavian governance, and the cultural sophistication necessary for ruling diverse populations. More importantly, he had absorbed lessons about the relationship between military power, administrative efficiency, and economic prosperity that would guide his later imperial ambitions. The Danish prince stood poised to participate in his father's greatest triumph, unaware that within months he would inherit responsibilities that would test every aspect of his careful preparation. The summer of 1013 marked the culmination of decades of Danish pressure against Anglo-Saxon England. Swene Forkbeard assembled the largest invasion fleet in living memory, drawing ships and warriors from across the Danish realm and its allied territories. Contemporary sources suggest the armada numbered over 200 vessels, ranging from the king's own dragon-headed flagship to smaller craft carrying supplies and siege equipment. Young Cnut commanded a significant portion of this force, leading contingents of Danish nobles and their retainers who had sworn personal loyalty to the Jelling dynasty. The prince's ship, likely a sleek warship of 60 oars, flew the Raven banner that would become synonymous with his later conquests. The invasion force landed first in the Humber estuary, exploiting the same river system that had served Viking raiders for generations. However, this campaign differed fundamentally from earlier expeditions. Rather than seeking quick plunder and withdrawal, Swene intended permanent conquest and the establishment of Danish rule over all England. The systematic nature of the operation became evident as Danish forces secured key river crossings, established fortified camps, and began coordinating with Scandinavian settlers throughout the old Danelaw territories. Cnut witnessed firsthand the transformation of military raid into political conquest, observing how his father balanced diplomatic overtures to potential English allies with relentless pressure against centres of resistance. The response from the Anglo-Saxon population revealed the deep fractures within Ethelred, the Unread's kingdom. Years of Danish raids, crushing tribute payments, and ineffective royal leadership had eroded confidence in the Anglo-Saxon monarchy. As Swene's forces advanced southward from their Humber bridgehead, entire regions submitted without significant resistance. The 5 boroughs, Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, Leicester and Stamford, opened their gates to the Danish army, their populations viewing Swene as a potential liberator rather than a foreign conqueror. These towns, with their mixed Anglo-Scandinavian populations and memories of earlier Danish rule, provided crucial bases for the expanding campaign. Cnut's role in these early victories extended beyond mere military leadership. His father assigned him responsibility for negotiating with surrendering English nobles and administering newly conquered territories. The young prince demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill, offering generous terms to Anglo-Saxon magnates who submitted promptly while making examples of those who resisted. At Northampton, Cnut presided over a ceremony where leading Mercian thanes formally transferred their allegiance from Ethelred to Swene, receiving confirmation of their lands and privileges in return. These experiences taught him the delicate balance between conquest and accommodation that would characterize his later reign. The systematic collapse of Anglo-Saxon resistance accelerated as Danish forces approached the Thames Valley. London, England's largest city and commercial centre, initially attempted to organise resistance under the leadership of Ethelred's son Edmund. However, the capital's defences proved inadequate against Danish siege techniques, perfected during decades of continental warfare. Sweyn's engineers constructed earthwork fortifications around the city while his fleet controlled the Thames, cutting off supplies and reinforcements. The psychological impact of seeing Danish ships anchored beneath London Bridge convinced many citizens that further resistance was futile. By Christmas 1013, Swene Forkbeard had achieved what generations of Viking raiders had only dreamed of, the conquest of Anglo-Saxon England. Ethelred the Unready fled to Normandy with his remaining supporters, abandoning his kingdom to the Danish invader. At a great assembly held in London, representatives from across England formally acknowledged Swene as their king, marking the end of the West Saxon dynasty that had ruled for over a century. Cnut stood beside his father during this momentous ceremony, wearing the war gear of a Danish prince but already beginning to understand the complexities of ruling a conquered population with different laws, customs and expectations. The establishment of Danish rule required immediate attention to administrative details that differed markedly from Scandinavian governance. Anglo-Saxon England possessed a sophisticated system of royal writs, chartered privileges and documentary records that had no equivalent in contemporary Denmark. Swene appointed Danish jarls to oversee major regions while retaining many Anglo-Saxon officials in subordinate positions, creating a hybrid administrative structure that balanced Danish military control with English bureaucratic expertise. Cnut observed these arrangements carefully, noting how his father adapted Scandinavian leadership methods to accommodate English institutional traditions. However, the triumph proved tragically brief. On February 3rd, 1014, Swene Forkbeard died suddenly at Gainsborough, possibly from illness contracted during the winter campaign. Contemporary chronicles provide few details about his death, though some sources suggest he suffered a stroke or heart attack while preparing for further military operations. The unexpected loss of their charismatic leader created an immediate crisis for the Danish occupation forces. Unlike Denmark, where succession typically involved lengthy negotiations among rival claimants, the English situation demanded rapid decision-making to prevent the collapse of newly established Danish rule. The Danish army proclaimed Cnut as Swene's successor, but the 18-year-old prince faced overwhelming challenges. Many English nobles who had submitted to his father viewed Swene's death as an opportunity to restore Anglo-Saxon independence. Messages flowed secretly between English magnates and the exiled Ethelred, coordinating plans for a general uprising against Danish rule. More critically, Cnut lacked the personal relationships and proven leadership that had enabled his father's conquest. Danish jarls who had followed Swene out of personal loyalty questioned whether they owed similar allegiance to his untested son. The English rebellion began almost immediately after news of Swene's death spread throughout the kingdom. Ethelred returned from Norman exile with promises of reform and forgiveness for those who had collaborated with the Danes. The Wittenagemot, England's royal council, formally restored the Anglo-Saxon monarchy and declared Cnut's kingship illegitimate. Armed resistance erupted across the country as English thanes attacked isolated Danish garrisons and severed supply lines between major Danish strongholds. The speed and coordination of this uprising demonstrated the shallow roots of Danish rule and the continuing strength of Anglo-Saxon political identity. Faced with deteriorating military situation and uncertain support from his own forces, Cnut made the difficult decision to withdraw from England. However, the retreat was neither panicked nor disorganised. The young king demonstrated strategic thinking beyond his years, conducting a fighting withdrawal that preserved the core of his army while extracting maximum resources from territories he could no longer hold. Danish forces systematically plundered the regions through which they passed, carrying off livestock, treasure and captives to compensate for the campaign's failure. At Sandwich, Cnut ordered the mutilation of English hostages taken during his father's conquest, sending a brutal message about the consequences of rebellion against Danish rule. The return to Denmark in spring 1014 represented both defeat and opportunity for the young king. Sweyn's death had created succession disputes within the Danish realm itself, as Cnut's older brother Harold claimed the throne based on his presence in Denmark during the English campaign. The brothers eventually negotiated a division of their inheritance, with Harold receiving Denmark proper while Cnut retained claims to England and other overseas territories. This arrangement reflected practical realities rather than legal precedent, as Cnut's supporters consisted primarily of warriors whose fortunes depended on successful conquest rather than peaceful governance of Danish territories. The months following Cnut's return witnessed intensive preparations for a renewed assault on England. The young king understood that his legitimacy depended entirely on military success, making the reconquest of England not merely desirable but essential for his political survival. He spent the remainder of 1014 and early 1015 assembling the largest invasion force in Scandinavian history, drawing warriors from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and the Baltic Slavic regions. Contemporary sources suggest this armada eventually numbered over 300 ships carrying perhaps 10,000 warriors, representing a massive investment of resources that demonstrated Cnut's commitment to permanent conquest rather than temporary raiding. The recruitment process revealed Cnut's growing political sophistication. Rather than relying solely on Danish nobles and their retainers, he actively courted Scandinavian adventurers and exiles who possessed specific skills relevant to English conquest. Norwegian jarls fleeing political persecution at home brought knowledge of siege warfare and naval tactics. Swedish merchants familiar with English markets provided intelligence about economic conditions and political divisions. Slavic warriors from Vendland and Pomerania contributed expertise in river warfare and fortification construction. This cosmopolitan army reflected Cnut's understanding that successful conquest required diverse capabilities rather than simple numerical superiority. The invasion fleet that departed Danish waters in summer 1015 represented a quantum leap in Viking military organisation. Unlike earlier expeditions that resembled enlarged raiding parties, Cnut's force possessed the logistical capabilities necessary for sustained conquest. Dedicated supply ships carried siege equipment, construction tools, and provisions for extended campaigns. Specialised vessels transported horses for the Danish cavalry units that would prove crucial in later battles. Most importantly, the fleet included skilled craftsmen capable of constructing fortifications, repairing weapons, and maintaining the complex military machine that Cnut had assembled. The English landing occurred at Sandwich in Kent, the same location where Cnut had departed in defeat 18 months earlier. The symbolic significance was intentional, demonstrating the young king's determination to reverse his earlier humiliation. However, the strategic situation had changed dramatically since 1014. Ethelred's restoration had failed to address the fundamental problems that had enabled Danish conquest, and English resistance to renewed invasion proved fragmented and ineffective. Many Anglo-Saxon nobles remained neutral, calculating that Cnut's massive invasion force made resistance futile, while submission might preserve their positions under Danish rule. The systematic nature of Cnut's second conquest became evident as Danish forces secured key strategic positions throughout southern England. Rather than advancing directly toward London, the invasion army established fortified bases at Canterbury, Winchester, and other major towns, creating a network of strongholds that could support extended operations. Each captured settlement received a Danish garrison and administrative officials, while English nobles who submitted promptly retained their lands under Danish overlordship. This methodical approach reflected lessons learned during the failed occupation of 1013 to 1014, particularly the importance of establishing stable administrative control alongside military dominance. The The English response to Cnut's return revealed the continuing divisions within Anglo-Saxon society. Ethelred's health had deteriorated significantly during his Norman exile, leaving effective leadership to his son Edmund Ironside. However, Edmund's authority remained contested by rival claimants and regional magnates who pursued independent policies. Some English nobles actively collaborated with Danish forces, providing intelligence and supplies in exchange for confirmation of their privileges. Others adopted a strategy of passive resistance, avoiding direct confrontation while refusing active cooperation with either side. The campaign's decisive phase began in late 1015 as Cnut's forces consolidated control over southern England and prepared for operations against the remaining centres of Anglo-Saxon resistance. Edmund Ironside had assembled a substantial army in the Thames Valley, drawing support from the traditional heartland of West Saxon power. However, the English forces suffered from divided command, inadequate supplies, and uncertain morale among troops who had witnessed the systematic collapse of resistance throughout the kingdom. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine whether England remained Anglo-Saxon or became permanently integrated into Cnut's expanding Scandinavian empire. The Battle of Asundun on October 18th, 1016, represented the culmination of 3 years of warfare between Danish and Anglo-Saxon forces. The exact location remains disputed among historians, with sites in Essex and Suffolk both claiming the honour, but the battle's significance is unquestionable. Edmund Ironside had positioned his army on elevated ground overlooking the Danish advance, hoping to exploit the tactical advantages of defensive positioning that had served Anglo-Saxon forces well in earlier conflicts. His troops included the elite Huscarls of the royal household, regional levies from Wessex and Mercia, and contingents of Anglo-Danish nobles whose loyalty to the English cause remained questionable. Cnut's army approached the battlefield in the traditional Danish battle formation, with heavily armed Huscarls forming the centre, while lighter troops and archers occupied the flanks. The king himself commanded from the front ranks, his presence serving to inspire his multinational force and demonstrate his personal commitment to victory. Danish battle standards displaying ravens and dragons flew above the advancing columns, while war horns sounded the ancient melodies that had accompanied Scandinavian warriors into combat for generations. The sight of this disciplined force, numbering perhaps 6,000 seasoned warriors, must have been formidable to English observers accustomed to the more informal military arrangements of Anglo-Saxon warfare. The battle began with an exchange of missiles as Danish archers and English slingers sought to disrupt enemy formations before the main engagement commenced. Archaeological evidence from similar contemporary battlefields suggests that this preliminary phase could last several hours, with both sides probing for weaknesses while attempting to maintain formation integrity. The decisive moment came when Danish cavalry units, possibly including Slavic horsemen recruited specifically for this campaign, exploited a gap in the English line created by the defection of Edric Striona and his Mercian contingent. This betrayal, whether prearranged or opportunistic, shattered English morale and enabled Danish forces to envelop the Anglo-Saxon position. The collapse of English resistance at Asundun was swift and complete. Edmund Ironside fought with desperate courage, personally engaging Danish warriors in single combat and attempting to rally his disintegrating forces. However, the combination of tactical superiority, superior equipment, and treachery among his own supporters made English defeat inevitable. Contemporary chronicles record massive casualties among the Anglo-Saxon nobility, with many of England's leading families losing their heads or heirs in the disaster. The battlefield aftermath resembled a slaughter rather than a conventional military engagement, as Danish forces pursued fleeing English troops across the Essex countryside. The immediate consequences of Asundun extended far beyond military victory. Edmund Ironside, wounded but not captured, retreated westward with the remnants of his army, while Cnut's forces occupied London and the surrounding regions. However, both leaders recognised that continued warfare would benefit neither side, as England's resources had been exhausted by 3 years of conflict while Danish forces faced the prospect of indefinite occupation duties in a hostile land. Negotiations began almost immediately after the battle, mediated by English bishops and Danish jarls who understood the advantages of political settlement over prolonged military campaigns. The Treaty of Alnay, concluded in late 1016, divided England between the two surviving claimants while establishing mechanisms for eventual reunification under Danish rule. Edmund retained Wessex and its traditional dependencies, while Cnut received Mercia, Northumbria and East Anglia, essentially all of England north of the Thames. More significantly, the agreement stipulated that whichever king survived, the other would inherit the entire realm, making the partition temporary rather than permanent. This arrangement reflected the practical impossibility of maintaining stable government in a divided kingdom while acknowledging the military realities created by Danish conquest. The treaty negotiations reveal Cnut's growing political maturity and his understanding of English governmental traditions. Rather than imposing purely Danish administrative structures, he agreed to maintain Anglo-Saxon legal customs and institutional arrangements in his territories, while integrating Danish military leadership with existing English bureaucratic systems. English bishops retained their positions and privileges, ensuring continuity in religious administration and providing legitimacy for Danish rule among the Christian population. Most importantly, Cnut promised to govern according to English law and custom, positioning himself as a legitimate English king rather than a foreign conqueror. Edmund Ironside's death in November 1016, possibly from wounds sustained at Assendun or from illness contracted during the subsequent campaign, eliminated the last obstacle to Cnut's complete conquest of England. The young Danish king, still only 21 years old, had achieved in 3 years what his father had accomplished in one brilliant campaign, demonstrating both the persistence necessary for successful conquest and the flexibility required for effective rule over diverse populations. The teenage prince who had fled England in defeat during 1014 had returned as a seasoned military commander capable of coordinating complex international campaigns and negotiating sophisticated political settlements. The unexpected death of Edmund Ironside in November 1016 transformed Cnut from a successful military commander into the undisputed ruler of Anglo-Saxon England. Contemporary sources provide conflicting accounts of Edmund's demise, with some suggesting death from battle wounds sustained at Assendun, while others point to illness or even assassination. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Edmund died at Oxford on November 30th, 1016, though it offers no specific cause. More suspicious accounts, including those found in later Scandinavian sagas, hint at treachery involving Edric Striona, the Mercian alderman whose betrayal had contributed to English defeat at Assendun. Regardless of the precise circumstances, Edmund's death eliminated the last legitimate claimant to the Anglo-Saxon throne and left Cnut as the sole authority over a kingdom that had resisted Danish rule for generations. The transition from divided rule to absolute monarchy presented Cnut with unprecedented challenges. Unlike his father's brief conquest in 1013 to 1014, which had collapsed immediately upon Sween's death, Cnut's position in late 1016 appeared more secure, but required careful management to prevent renewed rebellion. The Danish king controlled the most productive regions of England, commanded a battle-tested army of Scandinavian warriors, and had eliminated organised Anglo-Saxon military resistance. However, his authority rested primarily on military force rather than traditional legitimacy, making his rule vulnerable to the same nationalist uprising that had expelled Danish forces 2 years earlier. The young king's first priority involved securing recognition from the Anglo-Saxon nobility who had survived the recent conflicts. Many English magnates had adopted a cautious neutrality during the final campaigns, calculating that premature commitment to either side might prove fatal regardless of the war's outcome. These survivors now faced the delicate task of accommodating themselves to Danish rule while preserving their estates and local authority. Cnut demonstrated remarkable political acumen in managing this transition, offering generous terms to nobles who submitted promptly while making selective examples of those who maintained hostile attitudes toward his regime. The Christmas court of 1016, held at London in the traditional Anglo-Saxon manner, marked Cnut's formal assumption of English kingship. The ceremony carefully balanced Danish military triumph with Anglo-Saxon constitutional traditions, demonstrating the new king's understanding that effective rule required more than battlefield victory. English bishops performed the coronation ritual according to established precedent, while Danish jarls and Anglo-Saxon aldermen witnessed the proceedings as equals rather than as conquerors and conquered. Cnut received the traditional regalia of English monarchy, crown, sceptre and sword, from the hands of Archbishop Liffing of Canterbury, symbolically connecting his reign to the ancient West Saxon dynasty that had ruled England for over a century. The integration of Danish and Anglo-Saxon administrative systems began immediately after Cnut's coronation. The new king retained the sophisticated governmental machinery that had made England the wealthiest kingdom in Western Europe, including the system of royal writs, chartered privileges and documentary records that had no equivalent in contemporary Scandinavia. However, he superimposed Danish military leadership over existing English bureaucratic structures, creating a hybrid system that combined Scandinavian warrior culture with Anglo-Saxon administrative efficiency. Danish jarls received appointments as aldermen over major regions, while English thanes continued to serve as reeves, port-reeves and other local officials under Danish supervision. The most visible symbol of this administrative fusion appeared in Cnut's adoption of Anglo-Saxon legal traditions alongside Danish military customs. The king issued writs in Latin and Old English, according to established English precedent, while his court maintained the ceremonial protocols developed by previous Anglo-Saxon monarchs. Danish huscarls served as royal bodyguards and military advisors, but English clerks continued to manage the complex documentary requirements of royal government. This careful balance reflected Cnut's recognition that successful rule over England required accommodation with existing institutions rather than their wholesale replacement with Scandinavian alternatives. The elimination of potential rivals occupied much of Cnut's attention during his first years as king. Edmund Ironside's death had removed the most immediate threat to Danish rule, but other members of the Anglo-Saxon royal family remained alive and potentially dangerous. Edmund's infant sons, Edward and Edmund, represented future focal points for English resistance if they survived to adulthood and could attract noble support. Rather than executing these children, which might have provoked moral outrage among his Christian subjects, Cnut arranged their exile to distant courts where they could be monitored but not easily used against his regime. The fate of these royal children illustrates the complex diplomatic networks that connected medieval European courts. Cnut negotiated with King Olaf Skotkonung of Sweden to receive the boys initially, but they were subsequently transferred to Kiev and eventually to Hungary, where they remained under the protection of King Stephen I. This arrangement served multiple purposes for the Danish king. The children's survival demonstrated his Christian mercy and distinguished his rule from the brutal conquest typical of earlier Viking expeditions. Simultaneously, their distant exile eliminated any immediate threat while maintaining diplomatic relationships with important European allies who might prove valuable in future conflicts. The systematic elimination of potentially hostile Anglo-Saxon nobles proceeded more ruthlessly than the treatment of Edmund's children. Cnut identified approximately 40 English magnates whose wealth, territorial holdings, or political connections posed threats to Danish rule. Rather than conducting mass executions that might provoke general rebellion, the king employed various methods to neutralize these individuals while minimizing political backlash. Some nobles died in suspicious circumstances that could be attributed to natural causes or accidents. Others found themselves charged with treason based on real or fabricated evidence of communication with foreign enemies. The most fortunate faced exile and forfeiture of their English estates, though they typically retained enough wealth to establish themselves in foreign courts. The execution of Edric Straener in 1017 demonstrated Cnut's understanding that even useful collaborators could become liabilities if their treachery made them untrustworthy allies. Edric had betrayed Edmund Ironside at the crucial moment during the Battle of Assendon, enabling Danish victory through his defection with the Mercian contingent. However, his willingness to abandon his sworn lord for personal advantage made him equally likely to betray Danish interests if circumstances changed. Contemporary sources suggest that Edric expected substantial rewards for his collaboration, possibly including elevation to the position of chief advisor or even marriage alliance with Cnut's family. Instead, the Danish king ordered his execution on charges of treason, sending a clear message that betrayal of one's sworn allegiance would not be tolerated, even when it benefited Danish interests. The confiscation of estates belonging to eliminated Anglo-Saxon nobles provided Cnut with vast resources for rewarding his Danish supporters and purchasing the loyalty of surviving English magnates. The royal fisc expanded dramatically as rebel properties reverted to the crown, while the king redistributed selected holdings to create a new aristocracy loyal to his regime. Danish jarls received substantial English estates that transformed them from landless warriors into territorial magnates with vested interests in maintaining stable government. Simultaneously, Anglo-Saxon nobles who had demonstrated loyalty during the conquest received confirmation of their existing holdings, plus additional grants from confiscated properties, binding their fortunes to the success of Danish rule. The most significant political stroke of Cnut's early reign involved his strategic marriage to Emma of Normandy in 1017. Emma, the widow of Ethelred the Unready and mother of the future Edward the Confessor, represented a crucial link to Anglo-Saxon legitimacy that could strengthen Danish claims to the English throne. Her Norman origins also provided valuable diplomatic connections to one of the most powerful courts in Western Europe, where Ethelred's surviving sons remained in exile as potential threats to Cnut's rule. The marriage negotiations required delicate diplomacy, as Emma's consent was necessary to legitimize the union, while her Norman relatives demanded guarantees about her status and treatment under Danish rule. The wedding ceremony, conducted at Canterbury Cathedral in the presence of both Danish and Anglo-Saxon nobility, symbolized the fusion of conquest and legitimacy that characterized Cnut's approach to kingship. Emma brought to the marriage not merely her royal bloodline, but also extensive properties, political connections, and administrative experience gained during her previous marriage to Ethelred. Her household included Anglo-Saxon nobles, Norman knights, and clerical advisors who possessed detailed knowledge of English governmental procedures and European diplomatic networks. This cosmopolitan entourage provided Cnut with valuable expertise, while demonstrating his commitment to inclusive rule rather than purely Danish domination. The implementation of the Danegeld system represented perhaps Cnut's most important administrative innovation during his early reign. Unlike the irregular tribute payments extracted by earlier Danish raiders, the Danegeld evolved into a systematic tax that provided reliable revenue for maintaining professional military forces and supporting royal administration. The assessment and collection procedures built upon existing Anglo-Saxon taxation methods, particularly the geld system that had financed English resistance to Viking attacks. However, Cnut's version operated on a much larger scale and with greater efficiency than previous English taxes, generating unprecedented revenues that supported his expanding imperial ambitions. The Danegeld assessment required comprehensive surveys of English wealth and population that produced detailed records of landholding, agricultural productivity, and commercial activity throughout the kingdom. Royal commissioners travelled to every shire, conducting inquiries that resembled the later Domesday Book in their scope and precision. These investigations served multiple purposes beyond tax assessment, providing Cnut with detailed intelligence about potential sources of rebellion, identifying nobles whose loyalty remained questionable, and documenting the resources available for military campaigns in other theatres. The resulting archives represented the most comprehensive governmental records produced in early medieval Europe, testifying to the administrative sophistication that Danish rule brought to England. The integration of Danish military traditions with Anglo-Saxon administrative practices created a governmental system that combined the efficiency of English bureaucracy with the military effectiveness of Scandinavian warrior culture. Danish huscarls served alongside Anglo-Saxon thanes in the royal household, creating a cosmopolitan military elite that transcended ethnic boundaries. The king's personal guard included warriors from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and the Slavic regions, while English nobles contributed their traditional military service according to established feudal obligations. This fusion of military traditions produced a formidable fighting force that could operate effectively in both Scandinavian and English theatres of war. The establishment of Danish military colonies throughout England provided Cnut with reliable garrisons while creating permanent Scandinavian settlements that would support his regime even if popular rebellion occurred. These colonies typically centred on fortified positions that controlled river crossings, road junctions, or other strategic locations crucial for maintaining internal security. The colonists included Danish veterans of the conquest campaigns plus their families, creating stable communities with vested interests in preserving Danish rule. Each colony received grants of surrounding agricultural land sufficient to support its population, while the settlers maintained their military obligations and provided local security for royal officials and tax collectors. The religious dimension of Cnut's consolidation efforts required particularly careful management, as Christianity provided a potential source of unity among his diverse subjects, while also connecting England to broader European political networks. The king demonstrated ostentatious piety through generous donations to monasteries, construction of new churches, and support for ecclesiastical reform movements. These religious activities served multiple political purposes, demonstrating Cnut's legitimacy as a Christian ruler, while building relationships with influential bishops and abbots whose support was crucial for effective governance. The church also provided administrative services that supplemented royal bureaucracy, as literate clerics served as scribes, advisors, and diplomatic agents throughout the kingdom. The development of diplomatic relationships with other European powers occupied increasing amounts of Cnut's attention as his English rule stabilised. The king maintained careful correspondence with the Holy Roman Emperor, the French monarchy, and various Italian princes, positioning England as an active participant in continental politics rather than an isolated northern kingdom. These diplomatic initiatives served both defensive and offensive purposes, creating alliances that discouraged foreign intervention in English affairs while building coalitions that could support Danish expansion into other territories. The marriage alliance with Normandy represented only one element in a comprehensive diplomatic strategy that would eventually encompass most of Western Europe. By 1020, Cnut had successfully transformed his military conquest into stable political rule that commanded acceptance from both Danish conquerors and Anglo-Saxon subjects. The systematic elimination of potential rivals, strategic marriage alliances, administrative innovations, and diplomatic initiatives had created a governmental system that combined the best features of Scandinavian and English political traditions. The young king who had fled England in defeat 6 years earlier had returned to establish one of the most effective monarchies in medieval Europe, setting the stage for imperial expansion that would eventually encompass Denmark, Norway, and portions of Sweden in addition to his English kingdom. The stability of Cnut's English kingdom by 1020 provided the foundation for his most audacious political gambit, the reunification of his father's Scandinavian territories under his personal rule. The death of Harald II of Denmark in 1018 had created a succession crisis that threatened to fragment the Danish realm among competing claimants, each backed by different factions of the nobility and supported by foreign allies seeking to exploit Danish weakness. Harald's reign had been marked by increasing tensions with the powerful Jarls who controlled vast territories in Jutland and the Danish islands, many of whom had grown wealthy through their participation in English campaigns, but resented royal attempts to centralise authority at their expense. The circumstances surrounding Harald's death remain obscured by conflicting contemporary accounts, though most sources agree that he died during a hunting expedition near Roskilde in the autumn of 1018. Some chronicles suggest natural causes, possibly a heart attack or stroke brought on by the physical exertion of the chase, while others hint at more sinister possibilities involving poisoned arrows or deliberate accidents arranged by political enemies. The timing proved particularly unfortunate for Danish stability, as Harald had failed to produce a clear succession plan or designate an heir apparent among his several sons. This oversight, common in Scandinavian royal families where multiple claimants often strengthened dynasties through internal competition, created an immediate power vacuum that ambitious nobles rushed to exploit. Cnut's claim to the Danish throne rested on both legal precedent and practical considerations that distinguished him from other potential successors. As the son of Sween Forkbeard and brother of the deceased Harald, he possessed legitimate hereditary rights according to traditional Scandinavian succession laws that favoured male relatives of the previous king. However, his prolonged absence in England had weakened his position among Danish nobles, who preferred rulers who remained physically present to address local concerns and participate in the complex network of personal relationships that governed Scandinavian politics. Many Jarls questioned whether Cnut's English responsibilities would prevent him from providing the direct leadership that Danish governance required. The most serious rival to Cnut's Danish ambitions emerged in the person of Thorkel the High, the powerful Jarl who had initially served Ethelred the Unready before switching sides to support Danish interests during the English conquest. Thorkel commanded substantial military forces drawn from his extensive holdings in Zealand and Scania, while his marriage connections to prominent Danish families provided him with influential allies throughout the kingdom. More significantly, his continuous residence in Scandinavia during Cnut's English campaigns had allowed him to build relationships with regional magnates who viewed him as a more suitable candidate for Danish kingship than an absent monarch preoccupied with foreign territories. The political manoeuvring that followed Harald's death revealed the sophisticated nature of Scandinavian succession politics, which involved far more than simple hereditary transmission of royal authority. Danish kingship required active consent from the major jarls and regional assemblies, making successful claimants dependent on their ability to build coalitions among competing noble factions. Thorkel leveraged his military reputation and territorial holdings to attract supporters who feared that Cnut's English commitments would subordinate Danish interests to the requirements of his southern kingdom. These nobles argued that Denmark needed a king who would prioritise Scandinavian affairs over the complex administrative demands of ruling Anglo-Saxon England. Cnut's response to the Danish succession crisis demonstrated the strategic thinking that had enabled his conquest of England. Rather than immediately departing for Denmark to press his claims through military force, he spent the winter of 1018 to 1019 carefully preparing a diplomatic and military campaign that would maximise his chances of success while minimising the risks to his English kingdom. The king assembled a substantial fleet of English and Danish ships, drawing vessels from the Royal Navy that he had expanded since 1016, as well as contributions from Anglo-Saxon magnates who saw advantage in supporting their monarch's Scandinavian ambitions. The composition of Cnut's invasion force reflected the multinational character of his regime and the resources that English wealth had placed at his disposal. Danish veterans of the English conquest formed the core of his army, their loyalty secured through generous land grants and regular payment from Danegeld revenues. However, the expedition also included significant contingents of Anglo-Saxon warriors led by English nobles who had prospered under Danish rule and now sought further advancement through participation in Scandinavian campaigns. Flemish mercenaries, Norman adventurers, and Slavic warriors from the Baltic regions supplemented these forces, creating an international army that demonstrated Cnut's ability to attract military talent from across northern Europe. The logistical preparations for the Danish campaign revealed the administrative sophistication that distinguished Cnut's operations from traditional Viking expeditions. Royal officials coordinated the assembly of supplies, siege equipment, and transport vessels with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized English governmental procedures. The expedition carried sufficient provisions for extended operations, portable forges for weapon maintenance, and engineering equipment capable of constructing field fortifications or conducting siege warfare against Danish strongholds. Most importantly, Cnut arranged for regular supply shipments from England to sustain his forces during what might prove to be a protracted campaign. The departure of Cnut's fleet from English ports in spring to 1019 marked the beginning of his most ambitious military undertaking since the conquest of England. The armada numbered over 150 ships carrying approximately 8,000 warriors, making it one of the largest Scandinavian expeditions of the early 11th century. The King's flagship, a magnificent vessel constructed in the English royal shipyards and decorated with gilded dragon heads and painted shields, flew the raven banners that had become synonymous with Danish military success. The sight of this formidable fleet crossing the North Sea must have been impressive to observers on both sides of the water, demonstrating the resources that English wealth had placed at Cnut's disposal. The initial landing in Denmark occurred at Limfjord in northern Jutland, a strategic location that provided access to the interior while avoiding the stronger fortifications around Zealand and the Danish islands, where Thorkel's supporters had concentrated their forces. Local jarls in the region, many of whom had participated in earlier English campaigns under Sweden Forkbeard, welcomed Cnut's arrival and provided intelligence about Thorkel's military preparations. These early supporters included several influential magnates who controlled extensive territories and could contribute substantial military forces to Cnut's cause, significantly strengthening his position in the developing succession struggle. The campaign's early phases resembled a political negotiation as much as a military conquest, with both sides attempting to attract neutral jarls through promises of reward and threats of punishment. Cnut demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill in these negotiations, offering generous terms to nobles who submitted promptly while making selective examples of those who actively supported his rivals. At Viborg, the traditional assembly site for Jutland's political elite, Cnut presided over ceremonies where prominent jarls formally acknowledged his kingship in exchange for confirmation of their existing privileges and grants of additional territories confiscated from Thorkel's supporters. The decisive confrontation between Cnut and Thorkel occurred at the Battle of Helgeia in late summer 1019, fought near the border between Denmark and Sweden, where Thorkel had hoped to receive military support from King Olaf Skotkonung. The battle demonstrated the tactical innovations that Cnut had developed during his English campaigns, particularly his use of combined arms tactics that integrated Danish infantry, Anglo-Saxon archers, and cavalry units recruited from various continental sources. Thorkel's forces, organised according to traditional Scandinavian methods that emphasised individual combat prowess over coordinated battlefield manoeuvres, proved unable to counter these tactical developments. The engagement began at dawn with exchanges of missile fire between opposing archer contingents, a preliminary phase that lasted several hours as both commanders sought to identify weaknesses in enemy formations. Cnut's Anglo-Saxon bowmen, equipped with the powerful longbows that had proven effective against Danish raiders in earlier conflicts, maintained superior range and accuracy over their Scandinavian counterparts. This archery advantage enabled Cnut's forces to disrupt Thorkel's battle line before the main infantry engagement commenced, creating gaps that Danish cavalry units could exploit during the decisive phase of combat. The collapse of Thorkel's army at Helgeir was swift and complete, with many of his supporters switching sides during the battle as Danish victory became apparent. Thorkel himself escaped the battlefield with a small bodyguard, fleeing towards Sweden where he hoped to find refuge at Olaf Skotkonung's court. However, his political influence had been shattered by military defeat, and former allies quickly abandoned his cause in favour of accommodation with the victorious Cnut. The battle's aftermath witnessed a general submission of Danish nobles who had previously supported rival claimants, as the demonstration of Cnut's military superiority convinced potential opponents that resistance would prove futile. The establishment of Cnut's authority over Denmark required immediate attention to the complex administrative challenges that differed significantly from English governmental traditions. Danish political culture emphasised personal relationships between kings and jarls, rather than the bureaucratic systems that characterised Anglo-Saxon administration, making effective rule dependent on Cnut's ability to maintain direct contact with regional magnates who expected regular consultation about policy decisions. The king addressed these expectations by conducting extensive progresses throughout the Danish realm, holding assemblies at traditional sites where local nobles could present grievances and receive royal justice. The integration of Danish and English administrative systems presented unprecedented challenges that required innovative solutions adapted to the different political traditions of each kingdom. Cnut established a system of dual governance that maintained separate administrative structures for Denmark and England, while coordinating policy decisions through a small group of trusted advisors who accompanied him between the two realms. Danish jarls retained their traditional autonomy over regional affairs, while accepting royal oversight of military obligations and major judicial decisions. English eldermen continued to operate according to established Anglo-Saxon procedures, while contributing to the expanded military forces that Danish expansion required. The appointment of loyal administrators to govern both kingdoms during Cnut's absence became crucial for maintaining stable rule over his expanding territories. In Denmark, the king elevated several jarls who had supported his succession to positions of enhanced authority, creating a network of regional governors who could coordinate policy implementation and military mobilization without requiring constant royal supervision. Thorkel the Tall, despite his earlier opposition, received forgiveness and appointment as regent for certain Danish territories, demonstrating Cnut's willingness to incorporate former enemies into his governmental system when their submission appeared genuine. The English administrative system required different arrangements that reflected the more sophisticated, bureaucratic traditions of Anglo-Saxon government. Cnut appointed Godwin of Wessex as his principal English deputy, granting him unprecedented authority over southern England, while retaining personal control of the royal household and military forces. Leofric of Mercia received similar responsibilities for central England, while Siward assumed governance of Northumbria with its complex mix of Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and Norwegian populations. These appointments created a system of regional governance that could function effectively during the king's extended absences in Scandinavia, while maintaining the loyalty of powerful English nobles through grants of enhanced authority. The economic integration of Denmark and England under Cnut's personal rule generated unprecedented wealth that supported his expanding imperial ambitions. Danish participation in English trade networks provided Scandinavian merchants with access to the sophisticated commercial systems that connected England to continental markets, while English silver continued to flow northward through tribute payments and military expenditures. The king established royal mints in major Danish towns that produced coins according to English standards, creating a unified monetary system that facilitated trade between his territories while demonstrating the extent of his authority over both kingdoms. The military implications of Cnut's Danish conquest extended far beyond the immediate succession struggle, as control of both England and Denmark provided him with unprecedented naval resources and strategic flexibility. The combined fleets of both kingdoms created the largest naval force in northern Europe, capable of projecting power across the North Sea, Baltic Sea, and Atlantic approaches to the British Isles. This maritime dominance enabled Cnut to threaten potential enemies while protecting his own territories from foreign intervention, fundamentally altering the strategic balance that had governed Scandinavian politics for generations. The diplomatic consequences of Danish reunification under English-based royal authority attracted attention from courts throughout Europe, as neighbouring rulers attempted to assess the implications of Cnut's expanding power for their own security interests. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry II opened negotiations aimed at defining the boundaries between imperial and Danish spheres of influence in the Baltic region, while the French monarchy sought to maintain cordial relationships with a ruler who controlled both sides of the English Channel through his English kingdom and Norman marriage alliance. Swedish and Norwegian leaders found themselves increasingly isolated as Cnut's growing power threatened to dominate Scandinavian politics entirely. By the end of 1019, Cnut had successfully established himself as undisputed ruler of both England and Denmark, creating a North Sea empire that commanded respect throughout medieval Europe. The systematic elimination of rival claimants, strategic appointment of loyal governors, and integration of administrative systems had created a unified governmental structure capable of coordinating policy across vast distances and diverse populations. The young king, who had inherited competing claims to scattered territories, had forged them into a coherent imperial system that would serve as the foundation for even more ambitious expansion into Norway and the Baltic regions. The consolidation of Cnut's dual monarchy over England and Denmark by 1020 had fundamentally altered the balance of power in Scandinavia, creating unprecedented opportunities for further expansion while simultaneously generating new threats from neighbouring kingdoms alarmed by Danish imperial growth. Norway, under the increasingly assertive rule of Olaf II Haraldsson, represented both the most attractive target for Cnut's ambitions and the most serious challenge to his northern dominance. The Norwegian king had spent the early years of his reign systematically centralising royal authority, implementing aggressive Christian reforms, and building military capabilities that directly threatened Danish interests in the Baltic and North Sea regions. Olaf Haraldsson's rise to power in Norway had followed a pattern remarkably similar to Cnut's own conquest of England, combining military prowess with political opportunism to establish royal authority over a previously fragmented kingdom. After years of service as a mercenary in various European conflicts, including campaigns in England, France and the Byzantine Empire, Olaf had returned to Norway in 1015 with substantial military experience and accumulated wealth sufficient to attract followers among the Norwegian nobility. His victory over the Danish-supported Jarls at the Battle of Nesjar in 1016 had established him as Norway's undisputed ruler while simultaneously eliminating Danish influence over Norwegian affairs. The Norwegian king's domestic policies created the conditions that would eventually enable Cnut's intervention in Norwegian politics. Olaf's determination to impose uniform Christian practices throughout Norway encountered fierce resistance from traditional Norwegian nobles who viewed his reforms as threats to their ancestral privileges and regional autonomy. The king's establishment of royal churches, appointment of foreign bishops, and suppression of pagan practices alienated powerful jarls whose authority had traditionally included religious leadership within their territories. More significantly, Olaf's efforts to centralise governmental administration and standardise legal procedures threatened the complex network of local customs and personal relationships that governed Norwegian political culture. The economic dimensions of Olaf's reforms proved equally controversial among the Norwegian aristocracy. The king's attempts to control trade routes, standardise weights and measures, and establish royal monopolies over certain commercial activities reduced the profits that regional magnates had traditionally derived from their territorial holdings. Norwegian jarls, who had grown wealthy through independent trading relationships with Danish, Swedish and English merchants, found their commercial freedoms increasingly restricted by royal regulations designed to enhance central authority at the expense of local autonomy. These economic grievances provided Cnut with potential allies among Norwegian nobles who might welcome Danish intervention as a means of preserving their traditional privileges. The religious character of Olaf's reforms created additional opportunities for Danish diplomatic intervention. The Norwegian king's zealous promotion of Christianity, while consistent with broader European trends toward religious uniformity, proceeded at a pace that many Norwegians found excessive and culturally destructive. Olaf's destruction of pagan temples, persecution of traditional religious practitioners, and importation of foreign clerics to staff newly established churches generated resentment among populations who viewed these changes as attacks on Norwegian cultural identity. The king's alliance with English bishops and continental religious reformers further reinforced perceptions that his policies served foreign interests rather than Norwegian traditions. Cnut's initial approach to Norwegian affairs emphasised diplomatic pressure and covert support for Olaf's domestic opponents, rather than direct military intervention. Danish agents established contact with disaffected Norwegian jarls, offering financial assistance and promises of future support in exchange for intelligence about Olaf's military preparations and political vulnerabilities. These early contacts revealed the extent of Norwegian noble dissatisfaction with their king's policies, as prominent magnates expressed willingness to consider alternatives to Olaf's increasingly autocratic rule. The most significant of these potential allies included Erling Skjalgsson, the powerful Jarl of Rogaland, and Harek's of Tjotta, whose extensive holdings in northern Norway provided strategic access to the important trade routes connecting Scandinavia with the Arctic regions. The gradual escalation of tensions between Denmark and Norway reflected broader strategic considerations that extended beyond immediate territorial disputes. Control of Norwegian harbours and coastal regions would provide Cnut with access to the lucrative fur trade that connected Scandinavia with continental markets, while Norwegian timber resources could supply the shipbuilding materials necessary for maintaining his expanding naval forces. More importantly, Norwegian submission would complete Danish dominance over the western approaches to the Baltic Sea, enabling Cnut to control maritime commerce between Scandinavia and the rest of Europe, while preventing potential enemies from using Norwegian bases for operations against Danish territories. The diplomatic crisis that precipitated open warfare between Denmark and Norway emerged from competing claims to sovereignty over the Orkney Islands, whose strategic location commanded the sea routes between Scotland, Norway and Denmark. Earl Sigurd the Stout of Orkney had traditionally acknowledged Norwegian overlordship, while maintaining practical independence in the administration of his island territories. However, Sigurd's death at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 had created a succession dispute that both Cnut and Olaf sought to exploit for their own advantage. The Danish king supported the claims of Thorfinn Sigurdsson, who promised to acknowledge Danish rather than Norwegian suzerainty, while Olaf backed rival claimants who would maintain traditional Norwegian influence over the islands. The Orkney succession dispute escalated into broader conflict when Norwegian forces occupied several of the islands in 1024, prompting Cnut to assemble a substantial fleet for operations in the northern waters. The Danish expedition, numbering over 100 ships drawn from both English and Danish naval resources, represented a significant escalation in the developing confrontation between the two kingdoms. However, rather than engaging in immediate naval combat, both sides recognised the advantages of attempting to resolve their differences through negotiation, leading to a series of diplomatic exchanges that revealed the fundamental incompatibility of their respective strategic objectives. The negotiations conducted at various locations along the Danish-Norwegian border during 1024 and 1025 demonstrated the sophisticated diplomatic protocols that governed inter-Scandinavian relations, while highlighting the personal animosity that had developed between Cnut and Olaf. Both kings possessed legitimate claims to regional hegemony based on their military achievements and dynastic connections, making compromise difficult without one side accepting a subordinate position that would undermine their authority among their own nobility. Olaf's insistence on maintaining Norwegian independence conflicted directly with Cnut's imperial ambitions, while the Danish king's demands for Norwegian submission threatened the political foundations of Olaf's domestic rule. The breakdown of diplomatic efforts in late 1025 coincided with Cnut's receipt of detailed intelligence about the extent of Norwegian noble dissatisfaction with Olaf's policies. Danish agents reported that significant numbers of Norwegian jarls would welcome foreign intervention if it promised to restore their traditional privileges and reduce royal interference in regional affairs. These reports encouraged Cnut to adopt a more aggressive approach that combined military pressure with political subversion, aiming to destabilize Olaf's regime from within while preparing for potential military conquest if diplomatic methods proved insufficient. The Danish strategy for Norwegian intervention drew heavily upon the successful techniques that Cnut had employed during his conquest of England, particularly the coordination of external military pressure with internal political opposition. Danish gold flowed to Norwegian nobles, who agreed to oppose Olaf's policies or remain neutral during potential military operations, while Danish agents spread propaganda emphasizing the benefits that Norwegian submission would bring to regional trade and political stability. These efforts proved particularly effective among Norwegian merchants and coastal communities whose prosperity depended on maritime commerce that Olaf's policies had increasingly restricted through royal monopolies and taxation. The military preparations for Norwegian operations required extensive coordination between Danish and English resources, as Cnut sought to assemble forces sufficient to overcome Norwegian resistance while maintaining adequate defences for his existing territories. The king established supply bases along the Danish coast and in the Orkney Islands, creating logistical networks capable of supporting extended military campaigns in Norwegian waters. English shipyards contributed vessels specifically designed for northern operations, while Danish yards produced the shallow draft warships necessary for operations in Norwegian fjords and coastal waters. The composition of Cnut's Norwegian expedition reflected the international character of his military resources and the diverse strategic objectives that the campaign was intended to achieve. Danish veterans formed the core of his forces, their experience in English and Baltic operations providing crucial expertise for the complex amphibious warfare that Norwegian geography would require. English contingents contributed archery units and siege specialists, whose skills had proven valuable during earlier Scandinavian campaigns, while mercenary forces from various continental sources provided additional military capabilities and demonstrated the extent of Cnut's diplomatic networks. The initial phase of the Norwegian campaign began in 1026 with coordinated attacks on Norwegian shipping and coastal settlements, designed to demonstrate Danish military capabilities while avoiding the major fortifications where Olaf had concentrated his defensive preparations. Danish raiding parties struck targets throughout the Norwegian coast, capturing vessels, disrupting trade, and encouraging local populations to question their king's ability to provide effective protection. These operations served both military and psychological purposes, weakening Norwegian economic resources while demonstrating to potential Norwegian allies that Danish support could prove decisive in any internal political struggle. The Norwegian response to Danish aggression revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Olaf's military position. The king possessed substantial naval forces and had established fortified positions at key strategic locations throughout his kingdom, enabling him to resist direct Danish assault while maintaining control over the most important Norwegian territories. However, his harsh domestic policies had alienated significant portions of the Norwegian nobility, making it difficult to mobilize the full resources of his kingdom for sustained military operations against Danish invasion forces. The pivotal moment in the developing conflict came with Cnut's successful recruitment of Håkon Eriksson, the son of Earl Eric of Lade, who possessed both legitimate claims to Norwegian royal authority and substantial military resources that could tip the balance against Olaf. Håkon's family had ruled northern Norway for generations before being displaced by Olaf's centralizing policies, making him a natural focal point for Norwegian opposition to the current regime. His agreement to acknowledge Danish overlordship in exchange for restoration to his ancestral territories provided Cnut with a Norwegian ally whose legitimacy could justify Danish intervention as support for rightful authority rather than foreign conquest. The alliance with Håkon Eriksson enabled Cnut to present his Norwegian operations as liberation rather than conquest, appealing to Norwegian nobles who opposed Olaf's policies but might have resisted purely Danish domination. Håkon's presence with the Danish forces provided political legitimacy for military operations, while his knowledge of Norwegian geography and politics proved invaluable for planning effective campaigns. More significantly, his recruitment encouraged other Norwegian nobles to consider switching sides, as his example demonstrated that cooperation with Danish forces could lead to restoration of traditional privileges rather than foreign subjugation. The military campaign that followed Håkon's recruitment demonstrated the sophisticated combined arms tactics that Cnut had developed through his various conquest experiences. Danish forces operated simultaneously in multiple Norwegian regions, preventing Olaf from concentrating his defences while enabling pro-Danish Norwegian nobles to secure their own territories without fear of immediate retaliation. The coordination of these dispersed operations required extensive use of naval communications and careful timing that showcased the administrative capabilities that distinguish Cnut's military organisation from traditional Viking expeditions. The siege of Trondheim in 1028 represented the culmination of Danish military pressure against Norwegian resistance. The city served as Olaf's primary stronghold and the symbolic centre of his royal authority, making its capture essential for establishing Danish control over Norway. However, the fortifications that Olaf had constructed around Trondheim were formidable, incorporating both traditional Scandinavian defensive techniques and innovations borrowed from continental European siege warfare. The Danish assault required sophisticated engineering capabilities and sustained logistical support that tested the limits of Cnut's military organisation. The success of the Trondheim siege resulted from a combination of military pressure and political subversion that exemplified Cnut's integrated approach to conquest. While Danish forces maintained their blockade of the city, agents within Trondheim negotiated with potential defectors among Olaf's supporters, offering generous terms for surrender while threatening harsh treatment for continued resistance. The gradual erosion of morale within the besieged city, combined with the arrival of additional Danish reinforcements and the defection of key Norwegian allies, eventually forced Olaf to abandon his capital and retreat toward the Swedish border. The collapse of organised Norwegian resistance following the fall of Trondheim enabled Cnut to establish Danish authority throughout most of Norway with minimal additional fighting. Norwegian jarls who had remained neutral during the earlier phases of the conflict now rushed to submit to the victorious Danish king, seeking confirmation of their territorial holdings and political privileges under the new regime. These submissions typically involved elaborate ceremonies that emphasized continuity with traditional Norwegian political customs, while acknowledging Danish imperial authority, demonstrating Cnut's understanding that effective rule required accommodation with existing institutional structures. The flight of Olaf Haraldsson to the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev removed the most significant obstacle to Danish consolidation of Norwegian territories, while creating potential complications for the future stability of Cnut's northern empire. Olaf's survival meant that Norwegian opponents of Danish rule retained a legitimate focal point for potential rebellion, while his presence at the powerful Kievan court provided him with access to military resources that might eventually enable his return to Norway. However, the immediate effects of his exile were beneficial for Danish interests, as his absence eliminated the charismatic leadership that had sustained Norwegian resistance to Cnut's imperial expansion. The establishment of Danish administration over Norway required careful attention to the complex regional variations that characterised Norwegian political culture. Unlike England, with its sophisticated bureaucratic traditions, or Denmark, with its relatively centralised royal authority, Norway consisted of numerous semi-autonomous regions whose local customs and political arrangements differed significantly from one another. Cnut addressed these challenges by appointing Danish governors to oversee major regions while retaining Norwegian jarls in subordinate positions where their local knowledge and established relationships could facilitate effective administration. The most significant administrative decision involved the appointment of Cnut's son Sweyn as King of Norway, under the regency of his mother Alfgifu of Northampton. This arrangement served multiple purposes for Danish imperial strategy, providing Norway with a resident monarch who could address local concerns while maintaining ultimate authority within Cnut's family. Alfgifu's Anglo-Saxon origins and administrative experience made her particularly well suited for managing the complex cultural negotiations that Norwegian governance required, while her personal loyalty to Cnut ensured that Norwegian policies would remain consistent with broader imperial objectives. The regency arrangement also reflected Cnut's recognition that effective rule over Norway would require long-term commitment and cultural sensitivity rather than purely military domination. Alfgifu established her court at Trondheim according to traditional Norwegian royal customs, maintaining many of the ceremonial practices and administrative procedures that had characterized previous Norwegian monarchies. However, she also introduced Danish military advisors and administrative officials whose presence ensured that Norwegian policies remained coordinated with imperial strategy while providing security against potential rebellions. The economic integration of Norway into Cnut's expanding empire generated substantial revenues while creating new strategic capabilities that enhanced Danish power throughout northern Europe. Norwegian timber resources supported expanded shipbuilding programs that increased the size of imperial naval forces, while Norwegian iron mines provided raw materials for weapon production and military equipment. The fur trade that connected northern Norway with continental markets became a royal monopoly that generated substantial profits for the imperial treasury, while Norwegian fishing grounds provided food supplies that reduced the logistical challenges of maintaining large military forces. The completion of Norwegian conquest by 1030 represented the culmination of Cnut's imperial ambitions and the creation of a North Sea empire that commanded unprecedented power throughout northern Europe. The systematic elimination of Norwegian independence through a combination of military pressure, political subversion, and administrative innovation had demonstrated the sophisticated strategic capabilities that distinguished Cnut's imperial methods from traditional Viking conquest techniques. However, the death of Olaf Haraldsson at the Battle of Stiklestad on July 29, 1030, while attempting to reclaim his throne with support from Swedish and Russian allies, would create new challenges for maintaining Danish authority over his former kingdom, as the fallen king's martyrdom began to generate the religious and political movements that would eventually threaten the stability of Cnut's northern territories. The establishment of Cnut's North Sea Empire by 1030 necessitated a fundamental transformation in his approach to European diplomacy, as the Danish king found himself governing territories that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Baltic Sea, while maintaining complex relationships with the most powerful courts of medieval Christendom. The consolidation of English, Danish, and Norwegian territories under his personal rule had created unprecedented opportunities for diplomatic influence, but it also generated new responsibilities and potential conflicts that required sophisticated political management. Unlike his predecessors, who had operated primarily within Scandinavian political networks, Cnut needed to establish himself as a legitimate participant in the broader European political system, while balancing the competing interests of his diverse subjects and territorial holdings. The transformation of Cnut from Viking conqueror to European statesman began with his systematic cultivation of marriage alliances that would integrate his dynasty into the established royal families of Western Europe. The most significant of these diplomatic marriages involved his daughter Gunhild, whose union with Henry III of the Holy Roman Empire in 1036 represented the culmination of years of careful negotiation between the Danish and imperial courts. The marriage negotiations had begun as early as 1033, when Conrad II recognised the strategic value of securing Danish friendship through dynastic alliance, particularly given Cnut's control over the Baltic trade routes that connected the Holy Roman Empire with Scandinavian and Russian markets. The preliminary discussions for Gunhild's marriage reveal the sophisticated diplomatic protocols that governed high medieval European politics. Imperial ambassadors travelled to Cnut's court at Winchester, where they participated in elaborate ceremonies that demonstrated the Danish king's adoption of continental European royal customs, while maintaining distinctively Scandinavian elements that emphasised his independent authority. The negotiations involved detailed discussions about dowry arrangements, territorial guarantees, and the political implications of uniting the Danish royal house with the Salian dynasty that ruled the Holy Roman Empire. Cnut's willingness to provide a substantial dowry, reportedly including significant quantities of English silver and Danish amber, demonstrated both his wealth and his commitment to establishing permanent diplomatic relationships with continental powers. The marriage alliance with the Holy Roman Empire served multiple strategic purposes beyond the immediate diplomatic advantages of imperial friendship. Henry III's position as the most powerful ruler in Western Europe provided Cnut with valuable protection against potential French or Flemish interference in English affairs, while the imperial connection enhanced his legitimacy among European courts that might otherwise have viewed him as an upstart Viking adventurer. The alliance also created opportunities for coordinated military action against common enemies, particularly the various Slavic princes who threatened both Danish territories in the Baltic and imperial interests in Eastern Europe. However, the most immediate diplomatic challenge facing Cnut involved managing his relationship with the papacy, whose approval was essential for legitimising his rule over Christian populations in England and Norway while providing spiritual sanction for his imperial ambitions. The Danish king's decision to undertake a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027 represented a calculated political gesture designed to demonstrate his piety while establishing personal relationships with the most influential figures in medieval Christendom. The pilgrimage coincided with the coronation of Conrad II as Holy Roman Emperor, enabling Cnut to participate in the most important ceremonial event of the medieval political calendar while conducting private negotiations with the European rulers who had assembled for the occasion. The journey to Rome required extensive preparation that reflected both the logistical challenges of medieval travel and the diplomatic opportunities that the pilgrimage presented. Cnut assembled a substantial entourage that included English bishops, Danish jarls, and Norwegian nobles, creating a cosmopolitan delegation that demonstrated the international character of his empire, while providing opportunities for his various subjects to establish their own diplomatic relationships. The royal party travelled overland through France and the Holy Roman Empire, stopping at major religious sites and political centres where Cnut could conduct informal diplomacy with local rulers while demonstrating his commitment to Christian pilgrimage traditions. The reception that Cnut received during his journey to Rome exceeded the expectations of contemporary observers and established his reputation as one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. At the monastery of Saint-Bertin in Flanders, the Danish king participated in elaborate religious ceremonies while negotiating commercial agreements that would benefit Flemish merchants trading in English markets. The Count of Flanders, recognising the advantages of maintaining good relations with a ruler who controlled both sides of the English Channel, provided Cnut with military escorts and diplomatic introductions that facilitated his passage through the complex political landscape of northern France. The meetings between Cnut and the French nobility during his Roman pilgrimage reveal the careful balance of cooperation and competition that characterized medieval European diplomacy. King Robert II of France received the Danish monarch with appropriate honours while privately expressing concerns about the implications of English-Danish unity for French security interests. The French court was particularly worried about potential Norman-Danish cooperation, given Cnut's marriage to Emma of Normandy and his growing influence over Channel shipping routes. However, both sides recognised the mutual benefits of maintaining peaceful relations, leading to informal agreements about trade protection and mutual non-interference in each other's territorial disputes. The diplomatic complexities of Cnut's Roman journey became even more apparent during his passage through the Holy Roman Empire, where his presence attracted attention from numerous German princes seeking to establish relationships with the powerful northern monarch. The Duke of Bavaria provided elaborate hospitality while discussing potential cooperation against Hungarian raiders who threatened both Bavarian territories and Danish commercial interests in Eastern Europe. The Archbishop of Cologne, recognising Cnut's influence over English church affairs, sought guarantees about the protection of German merchants trading in London and other English commercial centres. The arrival of Cnut's entourage in Rome during Easter week 1027 created a sensation among the assembled European nobility and clergy who had gathered for Conrad II's imperial coronation. The Danish king's presence at such a prestigious event demonstrated his acceptance into the highest levels of European political society, while providing unprecedented opportunities for diplomatic networking with rulers from across the continent. Contemporary chroniclers noted the magnificent appearance of Cnut's retinue, whose rich clothing and elaborate ceremonial weapons reflected the wealth that English tribute and Scandinavian trade had placed at the Danish monarch's disposal. The private meetings between Cnut and Pope John XIV addressed both spiritual and political concerns that affected the Danish king's relationship with the Catholic Church. The papal court was particularly interested in Cnut's efforts to promote Christian practices in Norway, where traditional pagan customs persisted despite official conversion policies. The Pope granted special privileges to English monasteries under Cnut's patronage while providing papal approval for the appointment of Scandinavian bishops who could advance Christian missionary work in the Baltic regions. These agreements enhanced Cnut's legitimacy as a Christian ruler, while providing the papacy with valuable allies in its efforts to expand Catholic influence throughout Northern Europe. The most significant political discussions during Cnut's Roman visit involved his extended negotiations with Conrad II, whose imperial authority provided crucial legitimacy for the Danish king's territorial claims, while offering opportunities for coordinated action against common enemies. The two monarchs spent several days in private consultation, discussing territorial boundaries in the Baltic region, commercial agreements affecting German-Danish trade, and potential military cooperation against Slavic princes who threatened both empires. The imperial recognition of Cnut's authority over his Scandinavian territories provided valuable diplomatic support for his ongoing efforts to maintain control over Norwegian and Danish nobles, who might otherwise have challenged his legitimacy. The ceremonial aspects of Cnut's Roman visit demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of medieval political symbolism and his commitment to establishing permanent relationships with continental European powers. The Danish king participated in the imperial coronation ceremony as an honoured guest, occupying a position of precedence that reflected his status as one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. His presence at such a prestigious event provided visual confirmation of his acceptance into the highest levels of European political society, while creating opportunities for informal diplomacy with rulers who might otherwise have remained inaccessible. The commercial negotiations that accompanied Cnut's diplomatic activities in Rome addressed practical concerns about trade protection and merchant privileges that affected the economic foundations of his empire. The Danish king secured papal guarantees for the protection of English merchants travelling to Italian markets, while obtaining imperial promises about the safety of Danish traders operating in German territories. These agreements created formal frameworks for commercial relationships that had previously operated according to informal arrangements, providing greater security for the international trade networks that generated much of Cnut's imperial revenue. The return journey from Rome provided additional opportunities for diplomatic engagement, as Cnut's entourage travelled through different European territories while making their way back to England. The Danish king stopped at the court of the Duke of Burgundy, where he negotiated agreements about wine imports and the protection of English pilgrims travelling to continental religious sites. Similar discussions occurred with various German princes, Flemish nobles and French magnates who recognised the advantages of maintaining good relations with such a powerful and wealthy monarch. The long-term consequences of Cnut's Roman pilgrimage extended far beyond the immediate diplomatic advantages that the journey had provided. The personal relationships that he established with European rulers created networks of communication and cooperation that would prove valuable throughout the remainder of his reign. The papal approval that he received for his Christian policies enhanced his legitimacy among his own subjects while providing spiritual sanction for his imperial ambitions. Most importantly, the recognition that he received from the Holy Roman Emperor established his position as a legitimate participant in European politics rather than merely a successful Viking adventurer. The development of formal trade agreements represented another crucial aspect of Cnut's continental diplomacy, as his control over English and Scandinavian commercial networks provided him with valuable leverage in negotiations with the European powers. The protection of English merchants throughout the North Sea and Baltic regions became a primary diplomatic objective, as the safety and prosperity of these traders directly affected the tax revenues that supported Cnut's military forces and administrative systems. The Danish king negotiated comprehensive agreements with Flemish, German, and French authorities that guaranteed safe passage for English merchants while establishing standardized procedures for resolving commercial disputes. The Baltic trade networks that connected Scandinavia with Russia and the Byzantine Empire required particularly careful diplomatic management, as these commercial relationships involved multiple political authorities and complex cultural negotiations. Cnut established formal agreements with Swedish rulers about the protection of Danish merchants travelling through Swedish territories, while negotiating similar arrangements with various Slavic princes who controlled important river routes connecting the Baltic with Russian markets. These commercial treaties often included military cooperation clauses that enabled coordinated action against pirates and raiders who threatened merchant shipping. The expansion of English commercial influence under Cnut's rule attracted attention from courts throughout Europe, as foreign rulers recognised both the opportunities and challenges that increased English trade presented for their own economic interests. The Flemish nobility, whose territories served as crucial intermediaries in the wool trade between England and continental markets, sought formal agreements that would guarantee continued access to English raw materials while providing protection for Flemish merchants operating in English ports. Similar negotiations occurred with German princes, whose territories controlled important river routes connecting English trade networks with the Central European markets. The correspondence between Cnut and various European rulers provides valuable insights into the sophisticated diplomatic networks that connected medieval European courts while revealing the personal relationships that supported formal political alliances. The Danish king maintained regular communication with the Holy Roman Emperor, the French monarchy, and various German princes, discussing everything from territorial disputes to marriage negotiations to commercial agreements. These letters, written in Latin according to established diplomatic protocols, demonstrate Cnut's adoption of continental European political customs, while revealing his strategic thinking about imperial expansion and consolidation. The emergence of Cnut as a major player in continental politics fundamentally altered the balance of power in medieval Europe while creating new opportunities and challenges for established political relationships. His control over English wealth, Danish naval power, and Norwegian territorial resources provided him with unprecedented influence in European affairs, enabling him to participate as an equal partner in negotiations with the most powerful monarchs of his era. However, this enhanced status also created new responsibilities and potential conflicts that required constant diplomatic attention to prevent the formation of hostile coalitions that might threaten his imperial territories. The integration of Scandinavian political traditions with continental European diplomatic practices created unique challenges for Cnut's foreign policy, as he needed to balance the expectations of his Viking heritage with the requirements of Christian monarchy. The Danish king's success in managing these competing demands demonstrated his remarkable political flexibility and his understanding that effective imperial rule required adaptation to local customs and international norms, rather than the imposition of purely Scandinavian practices throughout his territories. The diplomatic triumph of Cnut's Roman pilgrimage in 1027 marked a profound transformation in his approach to kingship that extended far beyond mere political calculation. Upon his return to England, the Danish monarch demonstrated a level of Christian devotion that surprised even his most religious subjects, embarking upon an ambitious program of church patronage and ecclesiastical reform that would fundamentally reshape the spiritual landscape of his empire. The king who had once led pagan warriors in brutal campaigns against Christian monasteries now devoted substantial portions of his royal treasury to rebuilding the very institutions his forces had previously destroyed, creating one of the most remarkable examples of religious conversion in medieval European history. The systematic reconstruction of English monasteries began immediately after Cnut's return from Rome, with the king personally overseeing the restoration of major religious houses that had suffered damage during the Danish conquest campaigns. At Ely Cathedral, royal craftsmen worked alongside monastic builders to repair the elaborate stone carvings that Danish axes had defaced during the siege of 1016, while the king's personal goldsmiths created new altar vessels to replace those that had been melted down for military pay. The restoration work extended beyond mere structural repairs, as Cnut commissioned new illuminated manuscripts to replace those destroyed during the conquest, employing Anglo-Saxon scribes whose expertise in religious art had made English monasteries renowned throughout Europe. The rebuilding of Canterbury Cathedral represented the most ambitious of these restoration projects, requiring coordination between English master masons, Danish metal workers, and continental craftsmen whose skills had been acquired during Cnut's diplomatic travels. The king established a permanent workshop within the cathedral precincts, where artisans from across his empire collaborated on creating new religious artwork that combined Anglo-Saxon artistic traditions with Scandinavian decorative motifs and continental European stylistic influences. The resulting fusion created a distinctive artistic style that reflected the cosmopolitan character of Cnut's court while demonstrating his commitment to surpassing the achievements of his Anglo-Saxon predecessors. The scale of Cnut's religious donations exceeded anything attempted by previous English monarchs, as the king allocated approximately 1/3 of his annual revenue to ecclesiastical purposes during the final decade of his reign. The royal treasury provided funds for constructing new stone churches in major English towns, establishing monastic schools that would train the next generation of English clergy, and purchasing relics from continental religious houses that enhanced the spiritual prestige of English monasteries. At Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, Cnut commissioned a new royal chapel whose elaborate decorations included precious stones imported from Byzantine markets and ivory carvings created by craftsmen trained in the imperial workshops of Constantinople. The appointment of religious advisors reflected Cnut's determination to surround himself with clerics whose theological expertise could guide his spiritual development while supporting his political objectives. Archbishop Ethelnoth of Canterbury became the king's principal ecclesiastical counsellor, providing daily instruction in Christian doctrine while advising on religious policies that would strengthen royal authority throughout the empire. The archbishop's influence extended beyond purely spiritual matters, as his extensive correspondence with continental bishops provided Cnut with valuable intelligence about European political developments while establishing diplomatic relationships that complemented the king's secular foreign policy initiatives. The integration of Danish and English ecclesiastical structures required careful negotiation between competing religious traditions that had developed independently over several centuries. English monasteries followed the Benedictine rule with its emphasis on communal prayer, scholarly activity and agricultural labour, while Danish churches had adopted continental European practices that stressed individual devotion, missionary work, and close cooperation with secular authorities. Cnut addressed these differences by establishing mixed communities where English and Danish monks worked together under unified administrative structures that combined the best features of both traditions while maintaining respect for regional customs and local saints. The king's relationship with Archbishop Wulfstan of York proved particularly crucial for managing the religious complexities of his northern territories, where Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and Norwegian populations maintained different Christian practices alongside persistent pagan traditions. Wulfstan's legal expertise and theological learning made him invaluable for developing ecclesiastical policies that could accommodate diverse religious cultures while advancing Cnut's imperial objectives. The Archbishop's famous Sermon of the Wolf to the English had initially criticised Danish rule as divine punishment for English sins, but his subsequent collaboration with Cnut demonstrated the possibility of reconciling conquest with Christian governance. The development of a unified legal code that incorporated Christian principles with Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon legal traditions represented one of Cnut's most significant religious innovations. Working closely with Archbishop Wulfstan, the king promulgated comprehensive laws that established Christian marriage customs throughout his territories while maintaining traditional inheritance practices that respected local customs. The new legal framework required all subjects to observe Christian holy days and support their local churches through regular tithes, but it also preserved Scandinavian legal procedures for resolving disputes and determining compensation for criminal offences. The promotion of Christian values within Cnut's military forces created unique challenges that required balancing religious instruction with the practical requirements of maintaining effective fighting units. Danish Huskarls, who had grown up with traditional warrior values, found Christian teachings about mercy and forgiveness difficult to reconcile with their military duties, while Anglo-Saxon soldiers struggled to accept Danish military customs that seemed to conflict with Christian morality. The king addressed these tensions by appointing military chaplains who could provide spiritual guidance while understanding the realities of medieval warfare, creating a synthesis of Christian and warrior values that would influence military culture throughout Northern Europe. The establishment of royal chaplaincies throughout Cnut's territories provided mechanisms for extending Christian influence into regions where pagan practices persisted despite official conversion policies. In Norway, where traditional religious customs remained strong among rural populations, royal chaplains worked alongside local jarls to establish churches and promote Christian practices without completely suppressing the cultural traditions that maintained social cohesion in isolated communities. The chaplains received extensive training in local languages and customs, enabling them to communicate effectively with diverse populations while adapting Christian teachings to address specific regional concerns and traditional beliefs. The king's personal devotional practices became increasingly elaborate as his reign progressed, reflecting both genuine spiritual development and calculated political demonstration of his Christian commitment. Cnut maintained a rigorous schedule of daily prayers, attending multiple church services while conducting royal business and participating in extended religious ceremonies on major Christian holidays. The royal household included numerous clerics who provided continuous spiritual guidance while serving as scribes, advisors, and diplomatic agents throughout the empire. The king's personal chapel at Winchester contained an extensive collection of religious books, relics, and ceremonial objects that rivaled those found in major continental monasteries. The patronage of religious scholarship represented another crucial aspect of Cnut's ecclesiastical policies, as the king recognised that Christian learning provided essential support for effective governance while enhancing the cultural prestige of his empire. Royal grants enabled English monasteries to expand their libraries and scriptoria, creating centres of learning that attracted scholars from across Europe while preserving and transmitting classical and Christian texts. The monastery at Glastonbury received particular royal attention, with Cnut commissioning new buildings and providing funds for copying rare manuscripts that enhanced the abbey's reputation as one of Europe's premier centres of religious learning. The development of missionary activities in the Baltic regions reflected Cnut's understanding that Christian expansion could serve both spiritual and political purposes in consolidating Danish influence over Slavic territories. Danish bishops worked alongside royal administrators to establish churches in newly conquered territories while providing religious instruction that complemented political integration efforts. The missionaries adapted Christian teachings to address local customs and beliefs, creating syncretic practices that facilitated religious conversion while maintaining cultural continuity that prevented rebellions based on religious grievances. The king's approach to traditional Scandinavian customs demonstrated remarkable political sensitivity, as he sought to maintain the loyalty of Danish and Norwegian followers while advancing Christian policies throughout his territories. Rather than completely suppressing traditional festivals and cultural practices, Cnut encouraged their gradual transformation into Christian celebrations that preserved familiar elements while introducing new religious content. The winter solstice celebrations became Christmas festivals that maintained traditional feasting and gift-giving customs while incorporating Christian prayers and religious ceremonies that honoured the birth of Christ rather than pagan deities. The construction of royal churches in major Scandinavian towns provided visible symbols of Christian authority while creating centres for religious instruction and cultural integration. At Roskilde, the ancient seat of Danish royal power, Cnut commissioned a magnificent stone church whose elaborate decorations combined traditional Scandinavian artistic motifs with Christian iconography that demonstrated the compatibility of Danish cultural identity with Christian faith. The church served as both a royal chapel and a training centre for Danish clergy, who would staff other religious institutions throughout the empire. The establishment of diplomatic relationships with continental monasteries created networks of religious and political communication that enhanced Cnut's influence throughout Europe, while providing his subjects with access to advanced theological learning and artistic techniques. English and Danish monks travelled to study at famous continental abbeys, returning with new knowledge and skills that enriched the intellectual life of Cnut's empire while establishing personal relationships that supported diplomatic initiatives. The Abbey of Cluny became particularly important in these exchanges, as its reformed Benedictine practices provided models for monastic reform throughout Cnut's territories. The king's religious policies toward Jewish communities within his territories reflected the complex relationship between Christian theology and practical governance that characterized medieval European monarchy. While maintaining the traditional Christian restrictions on Jewish commercial activities and social interactions, Cnut recognized the economic value of Jewish merchants and moneylenders, whose services were essential for international trade and royal finance. Royal protection enabled Jewish communities in London and other major English towns to maintain their religious practices, while contributing their expertise to the commercial networks that generated imperial revenue. The integration of Christian and royal ceremonial created new forms of political ritual that enhanced Cnut's authority while demonstrating his commitment to Christian kingship. Royal coronations, court ceremonies, and diplomatic receptions incorporated elaborate religious elements that emphasized divine sanction for royal authority while maintaining the martial displays and personal loyalty oaths that characterized traditional Scandinavian political culture. The fusion of these ceremonial traditions created a distinctive imperial style that influenced royal courts throughout northern Europe, while providing models for subsequent medieval monarchs. The development of ecclesiastical administration within Cnut's empire required creating new institutional structures that could coordinate religious policies across vast territories with diverse populations and legal traditions. The king established a royal chancery staffed by clerics who managed correspondence with bishops, abbots, and other religious officials while maintaining records of ecclesiastical appointments, property grants, and legal decisions affecting church interests. This administrative system enabled centralized coordination of religious policies, while respecting local customs and maintaining the personal relationships that governed medieval ecclesiastical politics. The patronage of religious art and architecture during Cnut's reign produced some of the finest examples of early medieval Christian culture, as royal resources enabled craftsmen to experiment with new techniques and materials while creating works that celebrated both Christian faith and royal authority. The illuminated manuscripts produced in English scriptoria during this period combined Anglo-Saxon artistic traditions with Scandinavian decorative motifs and continental European stylistic influences, creating a distinctive artistic synthesis that reflected the cosmopolitan character of Cnut's empire while advancing Christian theological and devotional literature. The transformation of Cnut's religious policies after 1027 created new administrative challenges that required unprecedented innovation in medieval governmental practice. Managing an empire that stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the Baltic shores while accommodating Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, Danish customs, and emerging Christian principles demanded a sophisticated approach to lawmaking that went far beyond the simple military administration that had initially sustained Danish rule. The king's legal advisors, led by Archbishop Wulfstan of York, began the complex task of creating unified legal codes that could function effectively across diverse populations while maintaining the cultural identities that ensured local stability and prevented rebellions based on legal grievances. The development of these comprehensive legal frameworks began with careful analysis of existing law codes from each of Cnut's territories. Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, codified in the laws of Alfred, Edward, and Ethelred, emphasized written documentation, royal writs, and complex procedures for property disputes that reflected the sophisticated administrative culture of late Anglo-Saxon England. Danish legal customs, by contrast, relied heavily on oral traditions, personal oaths, and compensation payments that maintained social harmony through negotiated settlements rather than punitive justice. Norwegian legal practices added another layer of complexity as regional assemblies maintained ancient customs that varied significantly between different fjord communities and highland territories. The synthesis of these diverse legal traditions required extensive consultation with legal experts from throughout Cnut's empire. English bishops provided expertise in canon law and written legal procedures, while Danish jarls contributed knowledge of traditional Scandinavian compensation systems and oath-taking rituals. Norwegian legal speakers, the specialized officials who memorized and recited traditional laws at regional assemblies, travelled to Cnut's court to explain the intricate customary practices that governed everything from inheritance disputes to maritime commerce in their homeland. The resulting legal conferences, held at Winchester and later at Roskilde, brought together the most knowledgeable legal minds in Northern Europe to create unprecedented syntheses of different legal cultures. The first comprehensive legal code to emerge from these deliberations addressed the fundamental question of personal status within Cnut's diverse empire. The new laws established clear categories for different types of subjects: Anglo-Saxon thanes, Danish jarls, Norwegian bondi, and various categories of unfree persons, while creating mechanisms for movement between these categories through military service, commercial success, or royal favour. Danish warriors who had received English estates gained the legal status of Anglo-Saxon thanes, with corresponding rights and obligations, while English nobles who demonstrated loyalty to the Danish regime received recognition of their traditional privileges alongside new opportunities for advancement within the imperial administration. The integration of Christian principles into these legal frameworks presented particularly complex challenges, as canonical law often conflicted with traditional Scandinavian practices regarding marriage, inheritance, and personal conduct. The new legal codes attempted to balance Christian moral teachings with practical recognition of existing social relationships that could not be immediately transformed without causing widespread disruption. Polygamous marriages that had been contracted according to traditional Scandinavian customs received legal recognition, while new unions were required to follow Christian monogamous practices. Similarly, traditional inheritance customs that favoured male relatives continued to operate alongside new provisions that protected the rights of Christian widows and legitimate children. The administration of justice under these unified legal codes required creating new institutional structures that could operate effectively across the vast distances and diverse populations of Cnut's empire. The traditional Anglo-Saxon system of shire courts and hundred courts provided the foundation for local justice administration, but these institutions needed modification to accommodate Danish and Norwegian legal customs. Danish jarls received appointments as shire reeves in regions with significant Scandinavian populations, enabling them to apply their knowledge of traditional compensation procedures while operating within the established English administrative framework. Norwegian legal speakers were integrated into the court system as specialised advisors who could interpret traditional customs for English and Danish officials unfamiliar with Norwegian practices. The role of the Wittenagemot in England evolved significantly during Cnut's reign, as the king sought to balance traditional Anglo-Saxon governmental practices with the requirements of imperial administration. The assembly retained its traditional functions of advising the king on major policy decisions and confirming royal appointments, but its composition changed to reflect the multicultural character of Cnut's regime. Danish jarls and Norwegian nobles received seats alongside Anglo-Saxon ealdormen, creating a genuinely international royal council that could provide expertise on conditions throughout the empire while maintaining the legitimacy that Anglo-Saxon political traditions required. The meetings of the Wittenagemot during Cnut's later reign demonstrated the sophisticated political negotiations required to maintain consensus among diverse noble factions with different cultural backgrounds and competing interests. English ealdormen sought to preserve traditional Anglo-Saxon privileges while adapting to the realities of Danish imperial rule. Danish jarls attempted to secure their positions within the English political system while maintaining their connections to Scandinavian territories, and Norwegian representatives worked to protect their regional autonomy while participating in broader imperial policies. The king's success in managing these complex negotiations reflected his remarkable political skills and his understanding that effective imperial rule required constant accommodation among competing interests, rather than simple domination by any single cultural group. Similar assemblies in Denmark and Norway required different approaches that reflected the distinct political traditions of each kingdom while maintaining coordination with imperial policy objectives. The Danish assembly at Roskilde retained its traditional character as a gathering of jarls and regional magnates, but Cnut expanded its membership to include representatives from his English territories who could provide information about Anglo-Saxon administrative practices and commercial opportunities. The Norwegian assemblies, traditionally organised around regional things that addressed local concerns, were gradually integrated into a more centralised system that maintained local autonomy while ensuring coordination with imperial military and economic policies. The economic policies that supported Cnut's administrative innovations required unprecedented coordination between the different monetary systems and commercial practices that operated throughout his empire. England's sophisticated coinage system, based on silver pennies minted in royal workshops according to standardised weights and designs, provided the foundation for imperial monetary policy. However, the extension of this system to Denmark and Norway required establishing new mints and training local craftsmen in English techniques, while adapting coin designs to incorporate Scandinavian cultural symbols that would ensure acceptance among traditional populations. The management of royal revenues from such diverse sources created administrative challenges that required innovative solutions adapted to the different economic systems operating throughout Cnut's territories. English revenues derived primarily from the sophisticated tax system that had evolved during the Anglo-Saxon period, including land taxes, commercial duties, and the special assessments that had originally been developed to finance resistance to Viking raids. Danish revenues came largely from tribute payments extracted from conquered territories, profits from Baltic trade networks, and the personal wealth of jarls who owed military service to the king. Norwegian revenues were more limited and irregular, consisting mainly of tribute from regional assemblies, profits from fishing and timber exports, and the occasional windfall from successful raiding expeditions. The integration of these different revenue streams required creating new administrative procedures that could coordinate tax collection across vast distances, while accommodating the different legal and cultural traditions that governed economic relationships in each territory. English tax collectors, with their expertise in written records and systematic assessment procedures, were appointed to oversee revenue collection in Danish and Norwegian territories where their methods could be adapted to local conditions. Danish and Norwegian nobles received training in English administrative techniques, while retaining responsibility for collecting traditional forms of tribute and military service from their own territories. The coinage reforms implemented throughout Cnut's empire represented one of his most significant administrative achievements, creating a unified monetary system that facilitated trade while demonstrating royal authority through standardized designs and inscriptions. The new coins featured Cnut's portrait and titles in Latin, establishing his imperial status according to continental European precedents, while incorporating Scandinavian symbols that maintained cultural continuity with traditional Danish and Norwegian monetary practices. The silver content and weight standards followed English precedents that had gained international acceptance through centuries of commercial use, enabling Cnut's coins to circulate freely in European markets while providing reliable value for domestic transactions. The regulation of trade throughout Cnut's territories required balancing the competing interests of merchants from different cultural backgrounds while maintaining the royal revenues that commercial duties provided. English merchants, accustomed to sophisticated commercial law and standardized weights and measures, sought to extend their practices throughout the empire while protecting their traditional privileges in domestic markets. Danish and Norwegian traders, operating according to more informal customs based on personal relationships and traditional exchange rates, resisted attempts to impose uniform commercial regulations that might disadvantage their established business practices. The solution to these commercial conflicts involved creating flexible regulatory frameworks that maintained essential standards, while accommodating regional variations in business practices. Royal ports throughout the empire received standardized weights and measures based on English precedents, but local merchants were permitted to use traditional measurement systems in domestic transactions provided they could convert to royal standards when dealing with foreign traders or paying commercial duties. Similar accommodations were made for currency exchange, legal procedures for resolving commercial disputes, and the complex insurance arrangements that protected merchants against losses from piracy, shipwreck, or political instability. The military organisation of Cnut's empire represented perhaps his most innovative administrative achievement, successfully combining the Anglo-Saxon fyrd system with Scandinavian naval traditions and professional household troops to create a unified military structure capable of operating effectively across vast distances and diverse terrain. The traditional English fyrd provided a foundation of territorial levers organised around shire and 100 boundaries, enabling rapid mobilisation of local forces for defensive purposes while maintaining the agricultural productivity that supported the civilian population. However, this system required modification to accommodate the imperial responsibilities that extended far beyond traditional English territorial boundaries. The integration of Danish military traditions into this English foundation involved adapting the Scandinavian herd system that organised professional warriors around personal loyalty to individual leaders. Danish jarls, who had received English estates, maintained their traditional huskarl retinues while accepting obligations to provide military service according to English feudal customs. The resulting hybrid system created military units that combined the territorial organisation of Anglo-Saxon levies with the professional training and personal loyalty that characterised Scandinavian warrior culture. The naval component of Cnut's military organisation required even more complex coordination between different maritime traditions that had evolved independently over several centuries. English naval forces, traditionally organised around coastal defence and river patrol duties, needed expansion and modification to support imperial operations across the North Sea and Baltic waters. Danish naval expertise, developed through generations of long-distance raiding and trading expeditions, provided the foundation for creating ocean-going fleets capable of projecting power across vast distances while maintaining supply lines to support extended military campaigns. The household troops that formed the core of Cnut's military forces represented a unique synthesis of Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and Norwegian warrior traditions that created one of the most effective military units in medieval Europe. The huskarls, who served as royal bodyguards and elite infantry, received training in multiple fighting styles and weapon systems, enabling them to operate effectively in the diverse terrain and tactical situations that imperial military operations required. Anglo-Saxon huskarls learned to use the long Danish axes that had proven so effective in earlier Viking campaigns, while Danish warriors mastered the archery techniques and siege warfare methods that had enabled English resistance to earlier invasions. The organisation of these household troops reflected the international character of Cnut's court and the political requirements of maintaining loyalty among diverse noble factions. The Royal Guard included warriors from all of Cnut's territories, creating a cosmopolitan military elite that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries while maintaining the personal loyalty relationships that ensured reliable military service. English thanes served alongside Danish jarls and Norwegian bondi in units organised around shared military experience rather than cultural background, creating bonds of loyalty that supported imperial unity while providing the king with reliable military forces that could operate in any part of his territories. The logistics of maintaining these diverse military forces across such vast territories required unprecedented innovations in medieval military administration. Royal arsenals in major towns throughout the empire stockpiled weapons, armour, and military supplies that could support rapid mobilisation of local forces while providing equipment for visiting units from other territories. The standardisation of weapons and equipment enabled warriors from different cultural backgrounds to fight effectively together, while simplifying supply procedures and maintenance requirements that had previously complicated multinational military operations. The coordination of military operations across the empire required sophisticated communication systems that could transmit orders and intelligence across vast distances while maintaining security against enemy interception. Royal messengers, selected for their knowledge of local languages and geography, maintained regular communication between Cnut's various territories while providing the king with current information about military threats, political developments, and economic conditions throughout his empire. The development of standardized military signals and procedures enabled forces from different territories to coordinate their operations effectively while maintaining the flexibility that diverse tactical situations required. The death of Saint Olaf at the Battle of Stiklestad on July 29, 1030, created an immediate paradox that would ultimately undermine the foundations of Cnut's Norwegian dominion. While Danish forces had successfully eliminated the most dangerous threat to their rule, Olaf's martyrdom transformed a defeated political rival into a powerful religious symbol that galvanized Norwegian resistance in ways his living presence never could have achieved. Within months of the battle, reports began reaching Cnut's court of miraculous healings attributed to Olaf's intercession, strange lights appearing over his gravesite, and growing pilgrimages to locations associated with the fallen king. The Norwegian clergy, many of whom had initially supported Danish rule as a means of advancing ecclesiastical reform, found themselves caught between their administrative loyalties and the mounting popular veneration of Olaf as a saint and martyr for Norwegian independence. The transformation of Olaf from political opponent to religious icon occurred with remarkable speed, driven by a combination of genuine popular devotion and calculated political manipulation by Norwegian nobles seeking to mobilize resistance against Danish rule. The circumstances of his death at Stiklestad, where he had fallen fighting against overwhelming odds in an attempt to reclaim his rightful throne, provided all the elements necessary for martyrdom narratives that resonated powerfully with Norwegian cultural traditions. Stories circulated throughout the kingdom describing Olaf's final battle in terms that emphasized his sacrifice for Christian faith and Norwegian freedom, while accounts of posthumous miracles attributed supernatural power to his continued intervention in Norwegian affairs. The political implications of Olaf's growing sainthood became apparent, as Norwegian jarls who had previously collaborated with Danish rule began to distance themselves from Cnut's administration. Erling Skjalgsson, whose early support had been crucial for establishing Danish authority in western Norway, gradually reduced his cooperation with royal officials while avoiding open rebellion that might provoke military retaliation. Similar patterns emerged throughout the kingdom, as regional magnates calculated that association with the martyred Olaf's memory offered better long-term prospects than continued loyalty to an increasingly unpopular foreign regime. The administrative challenges created by this shifting political landscape were compounded by the growing unpopularity of Alf Gifu of Northampton's regency government, which had alienated Norwegian subjects through policies that appeared to prioritise Danish interests over local concerns. The heavy taxation required to support imperial military forces, the appointment of Danish officials to positions traditionally held by Norwegians, and the suppression of regional assemblies that had historically provided venues for local political participation created widespread resentment among populations who had initially accepted Danish rule as preferable to the chaos of civil war. Alf Gifu's attempts to implement English administrative practices in Norway encountered particular resistance from Norwegian nobles, who viewed these innovations as threats to their traditional privileges and cultural autonomy. The introduction of written legal procedures, standardized tax assessments, and centralized judicial administration conflicted with Norwegian customs that emphasized oral traditions, personal relationships, and regional autonomy in legal matters. The Regency government's efforts to suppress traditional Norwegian festivals and cultural practices in favour of Danish customs created additional grievances among populations who interpreted these policies as systematic attempts to destroy Norwegian cultural identity. The economic policies implemented under the Regency created further sources of discontent, as Danish officials sought to extract maximum revenue from Norwegian territories to support imperial military operations and administrative expenses. The imposition of new taxes on traditional Norwegian activities such as fishing, timber harvesting and fur trading reduced the incomes of local populations while generating revenues that appeared to flow primarily toward Danish interests. The establishment of royal monopolies over certain trade goods eliminated profitable opportunities for Norwegian merchants while creating advantages for Danish traders who possessed better access to imperial commercial networks. Meanwhile, in England, Cnut faced mounting pressure from Anglo-Saxon nobles who had grown increasingly assertive in their demands for greater autonomy and recognition of traditional English privileges. The king's prolonged absences in Scandinavia during the Norwegian campaigns had created power vacuums that ambitious English magnates had exploited to expand their territorial holdings and political influence. Godwin of Wessex in particular had consolidated his position as the dominant figure in southern England through strategic marriages, territorial acquisitions, and the cultivation of personal relationships with other Anglo-Saxon nobles who shared his concerns about Danish imperial policies. The growing independence of English nobles reflected broader changes in the political landscape that had developed during Cnut's 2-decade reign. The generation of Anglo-Saxon aristocrats who had witnessed the Danish conquest and accepted subordinate positions under foreign rule was gradually being replaced by younger nobles who had grown up under Danish dominion and felt less personal loyalty to Cnut's dynasty. These emerging leaders possessed detailed knowledge of English administrative systems and territorial resources, while maintaining cultural connections to Anglo-Saxon traditions that distinguished them from their Danish overlords. The economic foundations of Cnut's empire were simultaneously coming under increasing strain as the costs of maintaining military forces across vast territories began to exceed the revenues that imperial expansion had generated. The Danegeld system that had initially provided substantial resources for supporting professional armies and administrative bureaucracies was encountering resistance from populations who questioned the necessity of such heavy taxation now that external military threats had been eliminated. English taxpayers in particular began to argue that the tribute payments originally justified as protection against Viking raids were no longer necessary under a Danish king who controlled most of Scandinavia. The military expenses associated with maintaining imperial control over Norway proved particularly burdensome, as the mountainous terrain and dispersed population centres required substantial garrison forces that consumed resources without generating corresponding revenues. The Danish troops stationed throughout Norway needed regular supply shipments from England and Denmark, creating logistical costs that strained imperial finances while providing limited strategic benefits beyond maintaining political control over increasingly hostile populations. The naval forces required to patrol Norwegian fjords and maintain communication between scattered outposts represented additional expenses that diverted resources from more profitable imperial activities. The Baltic trade networks that had initially provided substantial revenues for Cnut's imperial expansion were encountering increased competition from alternative commercial routes that bypassed Danish territorial control. Swedish merchants had developed new trading relationships with Russian and Byzantine markets that reduced their dependence on Danish-controlled ports, while Flemish and German traders were establishing direct commercial connections with English markets that eliminated the need for Danish intermediaries. These commercial developments reduced the tribute payments and customs duties that had supported imperial military forces while creating alternative power centres that challenged Danish commercial dominance. The diplomatic isolation that gradually developed around Cnut's empire reflected the growing concerns of European rulers about the implications of continued Danish expansion for regional stability and their own security interests. The Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II, despite his earlier marriage alliance with Cnut's daughter, began to view Danish control over Baltic trade routes as a threat to imperial commercial interests and territorial security. French concerns about English-Danish cooperation in Channel waters led to diplomatic initiatives aimed at encouraging Anglo-Saxon resistance to Danish rule, while papal authorities expressed increasing discomfort with the political instability that imperial expansion was creating in Scandinavian Christian communities. The emergence of Magnus Olafsson as a focal point for Norwegian resistance represented the culmination of anti-Danish sentiment that had been building throughout the early 1030s. The young prince, who had been raised at the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev following his father's exile, possessed both legitimate claims to the Norwegian throne and access to military resources that could support a serious challenge to Danish rule. His return to Scandinavia in 1033 with Russian military backing provided Norwegian opponents of Danish rule with the leadership and external support necessary to organise effective resistance against Cnut's imperial administration. Magnus's initial successes in gaining support from Norwegian nobles reflected the extent to which Danish rule had become unpopular among populations who had initially welcomed it as an alternative to civil war and political instability. The prince's careful cultivation of his father's saintly reputation provided powerful religious legitimacy for his political claims, while his promises to restore traditional Norwegian customs and privileges attracted support from jarls who'd grown disillusioned with Danish administrative policies. The combination of religious symbolism and political pragmatism proved remarkably effective in mobilizing Norwegian resistance that had previously remained fragmented and ineffective. The military campaigns that followed Magnus's return to Norway revealed the extent to which Danish imperial control had weakened during the early 1030s. The garrison forces that Ælfgifu had maintained throughout the kingdom proved inadequate to suppress the widespread rebellions that erupted in support of Magnus's restoration, while the naval forces stationed in Norwegian waters lacked the local knowledge and popular support necessary for effective counterinsurgency operations. The mountainous terrain that had initially made Norwegian conquest difficult now worked to the advantage of local resistance forces who possessed superior knowledge of defensive positions and supply routes. The collapse of Danish authority in Norway occurred with surprising rapidity once the momentum of rebellion had been established. Regional assemblies that had been suppressed under the Regency government reconvened to declare their support for Magnus's restoration, while Danish officials and their Norwegian collaborators found themselves isolated and vulnerable to retaliation from populations who had endured years of unpopular foreign rule. The withdrawal of Danish forces from major Norwegian strongholds proceeded in stages as Ælfgifu recognized that continued military resistance would likely result in the complete destruction of Danish personnel and resources without achieving any meaningful political objectives. The loss of Norway represented more than a simple territorial setback for Cnut's imperial ambitions, as it demonstrated the fundamental limitations of personal monarchy in governing diverse populations across vast distances. The king's inability to maintain direct personal relationships with Norwegian nobles while simultaneously managing English and Danish affairs had created power vacuums that ambitious local leaders could exploit for their own advantage. The failure of administrative substitutes such as regency governments and appointed officials to provide adequate replacements for royal presence revealed the extent to which medieval imperial rule depended on personal charisma and direct political relationships rather than bureaucratic institutions. The psychological impact of Norwegian independence on other parts of Cnut's empire proved equally significant, as populations in England and Denmark began to question whether imperial unity could be maintained indefinitely under a single ruler. English nobles who had previously accepted Danish overlordship as a permanent political reality began to consider whether Anglo-Saxon independence might be achievable if Norwegian resistance could succeed in expelling Danish forces. Danish jarls conversely worried that continued imperial expansion had overextended royal resources and created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit to threaten the security of traditional Danish territories. The economic consequences of losing Norwegian territories extended beyond the immediate loss of tribute payments and commercial revenues, as the failure of imperial expansion raised questions about the long-term viability of the administrative systems that Cnut had created to govern his diverse territories. The substantial investments in Norwegian infrastructure, military installations and administrative personnel represented resources that could have been devoted to strengthening imperial control over England and Denmark, while the ongoing costs of attempting to maintain Norwegian control had diverted attention from emerging challenges in other parts of the empire. The diplomatic ramifications of Norwegian independence provided additional complications for Cnut's imperial policies, as Magnus's successful resistance encouraged other European rulers to reconsider their relationships with Danish power. Swedish King Anund Jacob, who had previously maintained careful neutrality in Danish-Norwegian conflicts, began to explore opportunities for expanding Swedish influence in the Baltic region, while Danish attention was focused on Norwegian affairs. The Polish Duke Mieszko II, seeking to recover territories lost to Danish expansion, initiated diplomatic contacts with Magnus and other opponents of Danish imperial rule to coordinate potential military cooperation against their common enemy. The internal political pressures that developed within England during the Norwegian crisis reflected the growing confidence of Anglo-Saxon nobles, who sensed opportunities to expand their autonomy, while Danish attention was diverted elsewhere. Godwin of Wessex in particular began to assert more independent authority over his territorial holdings, while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to Cnut's regime. Similar patterns emerged in Mercia and Northumbria, as regional magnates tested the limits of royal authority while preparing for potential changes in the imperial political structure that Norwegian independence might precipitate. The military implications of losing Norway extended beyond the immediate territorial losses, as the rebellion had demonstrated the vulnerability of Danish imperial forces to local resistance movements that possessed popular support and external assistance. The failure of professional Danish armies to suppress Norwegian insurgency raised questions about the effectiveness of imperial military organisation against determined opposition, while the successful coordination between Norwegian rebels and Russian allies suggested that future challenges might involve more sophisticated international coalitions than Cnut had previously encountered. The mounting pressures from Norwegian independence, English noble assertiveness, and economic strain converged during the final months of 1035 as Cnut's health began to deteriorate markedly. Contemporary sources describe the king experiencing recurring bouts of illness that forced him to cancel planned military campaigns and delegate increasing responsibilities to his regional governors. The precise nature of his ailment remains unclear, though chroniclers mention symptoms consistent with what modern medical analysis might identify as complications from years of strenuous campaigning, poor medieval hygiene, and the accumulated stress of governing an increasingly fractious empire across vast distances. The king's final journey to Shaftesbury in November 1035 appeared to contemporaries as an attempt to seek spiritual solace at one of England's most venerated religious sites. The abbey, founded by King Alfred and housing the remains of St. Edward the Martyr, represented the deep Anglo-Saxon Christian traditions that Cnut had worked to incorporate into his imperial identity. However, the practical circumstances of this pilgrimage suggested more urgent concerns, as royal officials had been quietly transferring treasury assets to secure locations, while key administrators received confidential instructions about succession procedures that implied the king's awareness of his deteriorating condition. On November 12, 1035, Cnut died at Shaftesbury, ending nearly 2 decades of Danish imperial rule that had fundamentally transformed the political landscape of Northern Europe. The immediate circumstances of his death created confusion among his retinue, as no clear succession plan had been established to address the complex territorial and dynastic challenges that his multi-kingdom empire presented. Unlike traditional Scandinavian succession practices that typically involved extended negotiations among potential claimants, the international scope of Cnut's territories required immediate decisions about governmental continuity that could prevent the collapse of imperial administration while rival claimants mobilized their supporters. The news of Cnut's death reached different parts of his empire at varying intervals, creating opportunities for rapid political maneuvering that would determine the fate of imperial unity. In England, where the royal court had been residing, news spread quickly throughout the kingdom within days of the king's death. Danish jarls and Anglo-Saxon nobles immediately began calculating their positions regarding potential successors, while royal officials attempted to maintain administrative continuity despite the uncertainty about future governmental structures. The speed of communication within England enabled coordinated responses that would prove crucial for the subsequent succession struggle. The delayed arrival of news in Denmark and Norway created different dynamics that reflected the distinct political cultures and current circumstances of each territory. Danish jarls, operating within traditional Scandinavian succession customs, expected extended negotiations among Cnut's various sons before any definitive resolution could be achieved. The absence of a clear designated heir meant that multiple claimants possessed legitimate arguments for inheriting different portions of their father's territories, setting the stage for the fragmentation that would ultimately destroy imperial unity. Harold Harefoot emerged as the most immediate beneficiary of the succession crisis, leveraging his presence in England and support from key Danish nobles to establish control over the English kingdom before his half-brothers could organise effective opposition. As Cnut's son by Ælfgifu of Northampton, Harold possessed both legitimate dynastic claims and crucial political connections that enabled rapid consolidation of power among the Danish military forces stationed throughout England. His supporters argued that his mother's Anglo-Saxon origins provided additional legitimacy for his ruling English territories, while his personal relationships with Danish jarls who had prospered under Cnut's regime secured essential military backing for his succession claims. The speed of Harold's political manoeuvring demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the factors that would determine succession outcomes in the immediate aftermath of Cnut's death. Rather than waiting for formal negotiations with his half-brothers, Harold moved quickly to secure control of the royal treasury, key fortifications, and administrative personnel who could provide governmental continuity during the transition period. His appointment of loyal supporters to crucial positions throughout the English administrative system created facts on the ground that would be difficult for rival claimants to reverse without extensive military campaigns that might destroy the very territories they sought to inherit. Harthacnut's position as Cnut's designated heir in Denmark provided him with stronger legal claims to imperial succession, but his physical absence from England during the crucial initial period following his father's death proved strategically disastrous. The Danish prince was campaigning against Magnus of Norway when news of Cnut's death reached Scandinavia, preventing him from immediately travelling to England to press his succession claims. The delay enabled Harold Harefoot to consolidate his position among English nobles and Danish military commanders who preferred dealing with a claimant who was physically present and capable of providing immediate governmental leadership. The political calculations that influenced noble support for different claimants revealed the complex motivations that had sustained Cnut's imperial system, while simultaneously containing the seeds of its destruction. Anglo-Saxon nobles who had prospered under Danish rule faced difficult choices between supporting Harold Harefoot, whose English residence suggested continuity with existing policies, and backing Harthacnut, whose legitimate claims might provide greater long-term stability, but whose Scandinavian focus raised concerns about English interests being subordinated to Danish priorities. Danish jarls confronted similar dilemmas as they weighed personal relationships with different claimants against strategic assessments of which succession outcome would best serve their territorial and commercial interests. Emma of Normandy's position during the succession crisis illustrated the diplomatic complexities that imperial marriages had created within Cnut's governmental system. As Cnut's widow and Harthacnut's mother, she possessed significant political influence and substantial territorial holdings that could affect succession outcomes. However, her Norman origins and previous marriage to Ethelred the Unready also made her a potential focal point for Anglo-Saxon nobles, who might prefer restoration of traditional English royal lines over continued Danish dominance. The Queen's careful navigation of these competing pressures demonstrated the sophisticated political skills that had enabled her survival and influence throughout the various regime changes that had characterised early 11th century English politics. The involvement of Edward and Alfred, Emma's sons from her previous marriage to Ethelred, added another layer of complexity to the succession dispute by introducing potential Anglo-Saxon claimants who possessed legitimate hereditary rights to the English throne. Their presence in Norman exile provided them with military resources and diplomatic support that could prove decisive if English nobles decided to reject Danish rule entirely in favour of restoring traditional West Saxon monarchy. The Norman court's calculations about supporting these potential claimants reflected broader European concerns about the implications of continued Danish imperial power for regional stability and commercial relationships. Svein Knutsson's claims to Norwegian territories created additional complications that extended the succession crisis beyond the immediate English-Danish dispute. As the nominal king of Norway under his mother Alfgifu's regency, Svein possessed theoretical rights to inherit his father's imperial titles, but the practical collapse of Danish authority in Norway following Magnus's successful rebellion had eliminated the territorial basis for such claims. The young prince's position illustrated the broader challenges that imperial overextension had created for Cnut's dynasty, as theoretical rights to distant territories proved meaningless without the military resources and popular support necessary to enforce them. The partition of Cnut's empire among his competing sons proceeded through a series of negotiations and military confrontations that revealed the fundamental weaknesses in the imperial system that had sustained Danish dominance for nearly 2 decades. The division of England between Harold Harefoot, who controlled the northern regions with their substantial Danish populations, and Harthur Cnut, who maintained claims to the southern territories through his mother's influence and Norman connections, created an inherently unstable arrangement that satisfied neither claimant while weakening both against potential external threats. The civil conflicts that erupted from these territorial divisions demonstrated how quickly the administrative and military systems that had sustained imperial unity could collapse when deprived of central coordination and shared purpose. Danish jarls who had previously cooperated in imperial campaigns now found themselves choosing sides in fraternal conflicts that pitted their personal loyalties against their territorial interests. Anglo-Saxon nobles exploited these divisions to expand their own autonomy while positioning themselves to benefit from whichever claimant ultimately achieved dominance. The military campaigns that followed the initial succession settlements revealed the extent to which imperial resources had been weakened by the prolonged Norwegian crisis and the economic strains of maintaining governmental systems across vast territories. The professional armies that had enabled Cnut's conquests fragmented along dynastic lines, as different military units declared loyalty to competing claimants. The naval forces that had provided imperial unity through control of sea communications found themselves divided among rival fleets that lacked the resources for coordinated operations across the North Sea and Baltic regions. The death of Harold Harefoot in 1040 temporarily reunified English territories under Harthacnut's rule, but this restoration proved both brief and problematic. Harthacnut's harsh policies toward English populations who had supported his half-brother created resentment that undermined the popular acceptance that had sustained Danish rule under Cnut's more accommodating approach. The new king's heavy taxation to support Danish military forces and his apparent preference for Danish advisors over English nobles reversed many of the integrative policies that had enabled successful imperial governance during the previous reign. The sudden death of Harthacnut in 1042, reportedly during a wedding feast in London, eliminated the last effective claimant to Cnut's imperial legacy and opened the way for the restoration of Anglo-Saxon monarchy under Edward the Confessor. The speed with which English nobles embraced Edward's return from Norman exile demonstrated how shallow the roots of Danish imperial loyalty had become once the personal charisma and political skills of Cnut himself were no longer available to maintain the complex accommodations that had sustained foreign rule over English populations. The collapse of Danish authority in England had immediate repercussions throughout Scandinavia, where the loss of English tribute payments and military resources eliminated the economic foundations that had supported imperial expansion and administrative innovation. Danish jarls who had received English estates found themselves reduced to their traditional Scandinavian holdings, while the professional military forces that had enabled imperial conquest were forced to seek alternative employment or return to traditional raiding activities that provided less reliable income than imperial service had offered. Magnus of Norway's expansion into Danish territories following the collapse of Cnut's empire demonstrated how quickly the strategic balance in Scandinavia could shift once imperial unity was broken. The Norwegian king's successful invasion of Denmark in 1042 reversed the territorial gains that Danish expansion had achieved over the previous generation, while his control of both Norwegian and Danish resources created a new power centre that threatened Swedish independence and challenged the traditional balance among Scandinavian kingdoms. The long-term historical significance of Cnut's reign extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of imperial collapse, as his innovations in law, administration and governmental organisation provided models that would influence medieval European statecraft for generations. The legal codes that had synthesized Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and Norwegian traditions established precedents for managing multicultural populations that later medieval rulers would adapt for their own imperial projects. The administrative techniques that had enabled coordination between distant territories provided organizational models that would prove valuable for subsequent attempts at European political unification. The ecclesiastical policies that Cnut had developed to legitimize foreign rule over Christian populations created templates for managing religious diversity that would influence medieval church-state relationships throughout Northern Europe. His successful integration of Christian kingship with Scandinavian warrior culture provided models for other pagan rulers seeking to establish themselves within the broader European Christian community, while his patronage of religious institutions demonstrated how military conquest could be transformed into legitimate political authority through systematic accommodation with existing spiritual traditions. The commercial innovations that had sustained imperial unity through coordinated trade networks and standardized monetary systems provided foundations for the expanded commercial relationships that would characterize later medieval economic development. The integration of English, Danish, and Norwegian markets under unified imperial administration created precedents for international commercial cooperation that would influence subsequent European economic integration, while the diplomatic networks that had sustained imperial foreign policy established patterns of international communication that would prove valuable for later medieval diplomatic initiatives. The military organisation that had enabled Cnut's imperial expansion provided tactical and strategic innovations that would influence European warfare for centuries. The combination of Anglo-Saxon territorial levies with Scandinavian professional warriors created integrated military systems that balanced local defensive capabilities with imperial offensive power, while the naval coordination that had sustained imperial communications established precedents for maritime cooperation that would prove crucial for later European colonial expansion. The ultimate failure of Cnut's imperial project reflected fundamental limitations in medieval governmental technology rather than personal shortcomings in leadership or strategic planning. The communication systems, administrative procedures and transportation networks available in the early 11th century simply could not sustain the level of coordination that governing diverse populations across vast distances required for extended periods. The personal charisma and political skills that had enabled Cnut's initial success could not be institutionalized sufficiently to survive the succession crisis that his death precipitated. However, the brief existence of Cnut's North Sea Empire demonstrated the possibilities for European political integration that would inspire subsequent medieval rulers while providing practical lessons about the challenges that such ambitious projects would encounter. The administrative innovations, legal syntheses, and diplomatic networks that had sustained imperial unity for nearly 2 decades provided foundations for later European political development, while the ultimate collapse of imperial authority illustrated the importance of sustainable governmental institutions that could survive dynastic transitions and political crises. The legacy of Cnut the Great thus encompasses both the remarkable achievements of medieval Europe's most successful attempt at multinational political integration and the sobering lessons about the limitations that technological and institutional constraints imposed on early medieval imperial ambitions. His reign marked the culmination of Viking Age political development, while pointing toward the more sophisticated governmental systems that would characterize later medieval European civilization, making his empire a crucial bridge between the warrior cultures of early medieval Scandinavia and the administrative monarchies that would dominate later European political development.